No shortcuts. Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age. Jane F. McAlevey. Contents. Acknowledgements. List of figures. List of tables 1. Introduction 2. The power to win is in the community, not the boardroom. 3. Nursing home unions. Class snuggle vs. Class struggle. 4. Chicago teachers. Building a resilient union. 5. Smithfield Foods. A huge success you've hardly heard about. 6. Make the Road New York. 7. Conclusion. Pretend power vs. Actual power. Notes. Bibliography. Index. Acknowledgements. When we master something new, books can help, but a good mentor is worth 1,000 books. The acknowledgements in this book can best be viewed as an update and super friendly amendment to the acknowledgements pages in my first book, Raising Expectations and Raising Hell, Verso Press, 2014. Any intelligence I display in this book is the cumulative wisdom of many decades of work in the field, where I had, literally, thousands of teachers. Raising Expectations was about union campaigns I participated in and mostly led. For this book, my new academic mentors told me firmly, despite my at times fierce protestations, that I had to use campaigns that I'd had nothing to do with for my empirical evidence. They were correct, of course. I haven't changed my opinion one iota of the many people to whom I owe tremendous thanks for their patience with me, for sharing key life lessons with me, for the endless time and skill they've invested in my thinking and my work, and, often, for their love. But I will limit my acknowledgements here to the players who have specifically helped me get through 5 years of a PhD program. Mapping my academic pursuit chronologically, I must first thank 2 people more than any others, the ones who talked me into the doctoral program. Larry Fox and Francis Fox Piven, who are not related on the Fox side, though I quickly discovered that they shared the gene for wicked intelligence. I'd had zero plans to attend graduate school, and couldn't imagine why I should shift out of full-time organizing. But when warfare inside the trade union movement led to the destruction of years of good efforts and dashed hopes and dreams and possibilities for thousands of workers, I knew it was time to step outside the fray, in order to observe and better reflect on and understand what was happening and what it meant for the future. At that very moment, coincidentally, I received an early stage cancer diagnosis that would require a full year of nothing but medically focused pursuits. It was during my Sloan Kettering year that Bob Osterdig talked me into writing down my reflections and offered to mentor me through a book. That project, with enthusiastic support from my Verso editor Andy Shao, became Raising Expectations and Raising Hell. Francis and Larry were early readers of the manuscript, and each came to the same conclusion: I should weather the political storm generated by my first book by going to graduate school for a few years. They've always given me good advice, and I thank each of them enormously for guiding me through complicated chapters of my life. Francis became in academia what Larry had been in my SEIU years, an incredible mentor. Once I made the decision to go back to school, there was the vexing issue of how to afford life in New York City as a graduate student. My sister, Catherine, who'd always held higher education as a top value, was thrilled with my decision, and along with her life partner, Deborah Hall, generously offered to support my housing needs for my first 2 years in New York. If my book has a dedication, it's certainly to Catherine, who lost her own cancer fight during my 3rd year in graduate school. I loved her wildly, and she was ecstatic about my getting a PhD. My brother Ben and his wife, Melissa, and her mother, Ann Barnes, also provided great logistical support that made some of my graduate school research easier, and more of it possible. My sister Bree has been a full-on cheerleader and supporter, as have my many other wonderful siblings and extended family. Beverly. Fewer's endless stories of how her generation, the CIO generation, built their unions strong has served as a timeless inspiration to my research. My cohort, the 2010 sociology cohort, is an extremely talented, fun, smart, supportive, and incredible team, a model of true solidarity. Most are women, a few are men we consider honorary women, all of them guided me through the early coursework and big exams. I could not have gotten through those first 2 years without my cohort. Marnie Brady and Bronwyn Dubchuck Land were regular and crucial readers at every stage of my book work. They were patient and flexible, constantly trying to teach me to use signposts in my academic writing and to persuade me to say the same thing 3 ways in the same chapter, a concept with which I still struggle. Erin Michaels, Dominique Nisperos, and Martha King pulled me successfully through 2 semesters of statistics. I chose not to attempt OLS regression in my final work, despite all they taught me. My committee, headed by Frances Fox Piven, and consisting of Dan Clausen, Bill Kornblum, and Jim Jasper, were terrific. They gave real meaning to the word patience. Each of them played a different and special role in helping me through this process. Please hold them harmless for any flaws, weak spots, bad ideas, or problems in this book, but do credit them for all the good. They were encouraging, they generously made time for me, and, like my cohort, they had to help me transition from being a field organizer to a later-in-life academic, at times a very challenging endeavor. I have enormous gratitude for my committee. Along the way, I had a robust, informal committee reading and commenting on various pieces of my writing. A team of overworked union and community organizers and union researchers, my reality checkers, whose lives are fully in the field, read either the entire dissertation or full first draft of the book and offered cogent comments. Ian Allison, Drew Astolfi, Seth Borgos, Sarah Buckley, Jonah Jinden, Becca Kirkpatrick, John Lackney, Katie Miles, and John Page. Their solidarity, enthusiasm, time, and dedication to making this book stronger has been remarkable. A second team donated brainpower and excellent suggestions on various chapters of this book, including Catherine Banghart, Colin Barker, Mark Brenner, Kate Bronfenbrenner, Sarah de Klerk, Janice Fine, Bill Fletcher, Marshall Gans, Sam Jinden, Jeff Goodwin, Doug Henwood, Patty Hoffman, Jane Holgate, John Krinsky, David Morris, Peter Olney, Deepak Pateria, Steve Pitts, Adolph Reed, Marianne Salm, George Schmidt, John Stam, Madeline Talbot, and Anthony Thigpen. As with my PhD committee, please spare these incredible people the blame for any failings on my part, but do recognize that they helped sharpen my thinking and writing. Additionally, James Cook, my editor at Oxford University Press, along with 2 anonymous peer reviewers in the Oxford review process, challenged me and greatly improved No Shortcuts. Rather than getting frustrated by one of my biggest weaknesses, impatience, James Cook may have set a record for getting this book to press. He was great. I am deeply appreciative to several people amid many who were quoted in and were part of the fieldwork and cases I studied. I thank every person who made time for an interview, and all for sharing their thoughts and ideas. But there are a special few who generously opened doors for me, who encouraged people to talk openly and honestly with me, who dug through their own archives and file boxes for me. These include Deborah Axt, Jean Bruskin, Jackson Potter, David Pickus, and Jonathan Rosenblum. Their work inspires and challenges me. In my field research and casework, a few people played key enabling roles. Susie Stewart, Maureen Pinto and Thea Chalmers cared for my trusted steed, Jalapeno, keeping him happy, in good physical shape, and well-loved during my long absences. Rati Kashyap, the more than able assistant in the Sociology Department at the City University of New York's Graduate Center, made every single academic thing work. Beyond individuals, a few institutions deserve credit in various ways for significant contributions during, and just after, my graduate school years. The fifth chapter of this book, the chapter on the Smithfield Foods campaign, I wrote while serving as a writing fellow and Boren Chertoff resident at the Blue Mountain Center, BMC, in upstate New York. I returned to BMC 1 year later to work on the revisions to the first full draft of this book. Verso Books published Raising Expectations and Raising Hell during my second year of graduate school, putting some of my ideas on a national and international stage, and greatly contributing to a crowd of new comrades in my life, people I met because they read my Verso book. The Nation magazine made me a contributing writer. The journal Politics and Society made me focus much more clearly on what I was trying to say as I worked through revising and resubmitting a September 2015 article that contains some of the core arguments in this book. The City University of New York's Graduate Center made me a fellow and underwrote my academic expenses. The American Association of University Women, AAUW, chose me as an American Dissertation Fellow for my final, 5th year, contributing decisive financial support that enabled me to stop consulting and focus on nothing but writing in my final push. And Oxford University Press, of course, is why this book is in your hands. Resources do matter. List of figures 2.1 An example of a structure test 2.2 Typical corporate campaign research schematic 2.3 Whole worker charting, social networks 2.4 Whole worker organizing schematic. List of tables 1.1 Options for change 1.2 Cases in the new millennium, 2000 to 2014 2.12 Models, mobilizing vs. Organizing 2.2 Power required concession costs. 2.3 Power available disruption costs. 3.1 Contract comparison, CTVS. WA 6.1 Make the Road New York staff, by gender, race, and ethnicity. No shortcuts. 1. Introduction. Curiously, the labor movement is conventionally ignored by scholars of social movements. Joseph Luder's The Civil Rights Movement and the Logic of Social Change 162nd footnote. There's an informal gestalt in much of academia that unions are not social movements at all, that union equates to undemocratic, top-down bureaucracy. Yet not all so-called social movement organizations SMOs fit their own definition of social. Many function from the top down as much as any bad union. An SMO's membership, if it has one, can be and often is as irrelevant and disregarded as the rank and file in the worst union. Likewise, scholars assume that material gain is the primary concern of unions, missing that workplace fights are most importantly about one of the deepest of human emotional needs, dignity. The day-in, day-out degradation of people's self-worth is what can drive workers to form the solidarity needed to face today's union busters. Earning my doctorate after long practical experience, as a young, radical student leader, then as a community organizer, a full-time educator at the Highlander Center, and, eventually, a union organizer and chief negotiator and an electoral campaign manager, I find it impossible to sort the process of progressive social change into two distinct piles or traditions. All of the unions I worked with were by any definition social movements, characterized by progressive goals that reached well beyond the workplace. Prefigurative decision-making, and robust participation by workers, their families, and their communities. In this book, in the term movement I consciously merge agencies that have been studied separately, the people in unions, who are called workers. And many of the same people after they have punched the clock at the end of their shift and put on their SMO, or interest group, volunteer hats. People who are then called individuals. Workers, too, are individuals. A divided approach to workplaces and communities prevents people and movements from winning more significant victories and building power. To the extent that a dichotomous approach persists in academia, it deprives scholars, students, and practitioners from better understanding two long-standing questions: why have unions faltered? And what must be done? My hypothesis is threefold. First, the reason that progressives have experienced a 4-decade decline in the United States is because of a significant and long-term shift away from deep organizing and toward shallow mobilizing. Second, the split between labor and social movement has hampered what little organizing has been done. Together, these two trends help account for the failure of unions and progressive politics, the ongoing shrinking of the public sphere, and unabashed rule by the worst and greediest corporate interests. Third, different approaches to change lead to different outcomes, often very different outcomes. I discuss 3 broad types of change processes: advocacy, mobilizing, and organizing, although my emphasis, if not my obsessive emphasis, is on the latter two. Each method produces a different kind of victory, and not all of these victories are equal, some are actually defeats. Only organizing can effectively challenge the gross inequality of power in the United States. Today, there is very little understanding of what factors lead to small, medium, and high-impact victories, or why. Power and power structure analysis. In the United States, c. Wright Mills popularized the concept of power and power structures in his book The Power Elite, published in 1956. In the 60 years since then, progressives have largely ignored and omitted discussions about power or power structures. Nothing produces deer-in-the-headlights moments for activists in the United States like the question, "What's your theory of power?" The 1967 follow-up book to Mills's work, Who Rules America?, by William Domhoff, and his present-day website bearing the same name, is still considered the best all-around go-to resource for local activists trying to understand how to do power-related research on their opponents. But Mills, Domhoff, and others who offer academic discussions of power largely attend to the power structures of the elites, of those who routinely exercise a great deal of power, national power in Mills's work, local power in Domhoff's. And the conversations about elite power can get very circular. They exercise it because they have it because they exercise it, were born into it, have friends with it. Part of what made Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward's 1977 book, Poor People's Movements, 3 so refreshing and smart, is that they inserted ordinary people into discussions about who can exercise power. In discussing power, I am going to put brackets around this very big concept. My interest, borne out by the empirical cases that follow, is in understanding the power structures of ordinary people and how they themselves can come to better understand their own power. There's plenty of evidence on the front pages of the New York Times that Mills's elites still rule. The level of raw privilege that a Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates or Jamie Dimon presently possesses isn't much different from that which Bertrand Russell described in his 1938 book Power as priestly and kingly. For that helps explain why multinational CEOs were included, and indistinguishable from, the Pope, kings, and presidents in the many photos taken at the December 2015 Climate Talks. 5 It doesn't seem all that difficult to understand how today's priestly kingly corporate class rules. But for people attempting to change this or that policy, especially if the change desired is meaningful, i.e., will change society, it is essential to first dissect and chart their target's numerous ties and networks. Even understanding whom to target, who the primary and secondary people and institutions are that will determine whether the campaign will succeed or society will change, often requires a highly detailed power structure analysis. This step is often skipped or is done poorly, which is partly why groups so often fail. Domhoff's website, combined with a dozen other more recent similar websites, such as Lil Sis, Corp Watch, and Subsidy Tracker, can help groups in the United States sharpen their analysis of precisely who needs to be defeated, overcome, or persuaded to achieve success. Understanding who the correct targets are and the forms of power they exercise should be only one step in a power structure analysis. 6 But often when that step is taken, it only plots the current power holders in relationship to one another. Good start, but keep going. What is almost never attempted is the absolutely essential corollary, a parallel careful, methodical, systematic, detailed analysis of power structures among the ordinary people who are or could be brought into the fight. Unions that still execute supermajority strikes have an excellent approach to better understanding how to analyze these power structures. To pull off a huge strike and win, as did the Chicago teachers in the new millennium, requires a detailed analysis of exactly which workers are likely to stand together, decide to defy their employer's threats of termination, and walk out in a high-risk collective action. Which key individual worker can sway exactly whom else, by name, and why? How strong is the support he or she has among exactly how many coworkers, and how do the organizers know this to be true? The ability to correctly answer these and many other related questions. Who does each worker know outside work? Why? How? How well? How can the worker reach and influence them? Will be the lifeblood of successful strikes in the new millennium. Liberals and most progressives don't do a full power structure analysis because, consciously or not, they accept the kind of elite theory of power that Mills popularized. They assume elites will always rule. At best, they debate how to replace a very naughty elite with a better elite, one they can work with, who wants workers to have enough money to shop the CEOs out of each crisis they create, who will give them a raise that they will spend on consuming goods they probably don't need. The search for these more friendly elites frames the imagination of liberals and progressives. An elite theory of power for well-intentioned liberals leads to the advocacy model. An elite theory of power for people further left than liberals, progressives, leads to the mobilizing model, because progressives set more substantive goals that require a display of potential power, or at least a threat of it. People to the left of both liberals and progressives have a different theory of power. Different because it assumes that the very idea of who holds power is itself contestable, and that elites can be pushed from priestly-kingly corporate rule. Though almost extinct nationally, there are still powerful unions operating at the local and regional level. These unions' democratic, open negotiations, in which tens of thousands of workers unite to stop bad employers from doing horrible things and then create enough power to pull up to the negotiations table as equals and determine something better, provide evidence that ordinary people can exercise both absolute power, power over, and creative power, power to. A focus of this book is on why and how to analyze this still vast potential power of ordinary people. Marshall Gans simplified the concept of strategy by explaining it as turning what you have into what you need to get what you want. 7. The word you is crucial and variable. How do people come to understand the first part of this sentence, what you have? And which people get to understand? Only those who understand what they have can meaningfully plot the what you need, create the steps that comprise the plan, plot and direct the course of action, and then get what you want. And because what you want is generally in proportion to what you think you can get, demands rise or fall based on what people believe they might reasonably achieve. Who is the actual you in what you want? To better understand outcomes, winning or losing, a little or a lot, requires breaking down each subclause in Gans's excellent definition of strategy. First, Gans rightly suggests that the specific biographies of those on leadership teams can directly affect strategy because diverse teams bring a range of salient knowledge and varied and relevant networks to the strategy war room. It follows, then, that the bigger the war room, the better. I expand who should be in the strategy war room from people with recognizable decision-making authority or position or title, such as lead organizer, vice president, researcher, director, steward, and executive board member, to specific individuals who have no titles but who are the organic leaders on whom the masses rely. Nurse, teacher, anesthesia tech, school bus driver, congregant, and voter. I urge a deeper dive into the specific backgrounds, networks, and salient knowledge of the masses involved, rather than only those of the leadership team. The rank and file matter just as much to outcomes, if not more, than the more formal leaders. Why? Large numbers of people transition from unthinking masses, or the grassroots, or the workers, to serious and highly invested actors exercising agency when they come to see, to understand, and to value the power of their own salient knowledge and networks. The chief way to help ordinary people go from object to subject is to teach them about their potential power by involving them as central actors in the process of developing the power structure analysis in their own campaigns, so they come to better understand their own power and that of their opponents. When they see that 3 of their own ministers and 2 of their city council members and the head of the PTA for their children's schools serve on commissions and boards with their CEOs, they themselves can begin to imagine and plot strategy. People participate to the degree they understand, but they also understand to the degree they participate. It's dialectical. Power structure analysis is the mechanism that enables ordinary people to understand their potential power and participate meaningfully in making strategy. When people understand the strategy because they helped make it, they will be invested for the long haul, sustained and propelled to achieve more meaningful wins. Three key variables are crucial to analyzing the potential for success in the change process: power, strategy, and engagement. Three questions must be asked. Is there a clear and comprehensive power structure analysis? Does the strategy adopted have any relationship to a power structure analysis? How, if at all, are individuals being approached and engaged in the process, including the power analysis and strategy, not just the resulting collective action? Many small advances can be and are won without engaging ordinary people, where the key actors are instead paid lawyers, lobbyists, and public relations professionals, helped by some good smoke and mirrors. That is an advocacy model, and small advances are all it can produce, but I am getting ahead of myself. Progressives, broadly defined, have enough resources to achieve a massive turnaround of the long reactionary political and economic trends in the United States, perhaps in all of the so-called Western industrialized countries. And substantial change can happen fast, in just a few years. Note this: climate change campaigners. Correct strategy and deep organizing can make things happen quickly. One implication of my argument is that the people controlling the movement's resources, the individuals who are decision makers in national unions and in philanthropy, have been focused on the wrong strategies for decades, leading to an extraordinary series of setbacks. Many of the biggest victories of the past 100 years, those won in the heyday of the labor and civil rights movements, have been all but rolled back. Yet some of the victories achieved by the people in these two movements were durable, and so have not been entirely lost, because they instituted major structural changes that were embedded in government policies at the national, state, and local levels. They achieved strong or relatively strong enforcement mechanisms. They achieved better funding and staffing for the enforcement agencies, and, most important, each victory became part of the everyday consciousness of most people. We know this because people who say they don't like unions will also say, at least in this country it's illegal for children to work in factories, or, I told the boss I wouldn't handle anything so toxic without protection, or simply, thank God it's Friday. That is, they don't like unions, but they see child labor laws, workplace safety regulations, the 8-hour workday, and the weekend, all benefits won by workers engaged in collective action through their unions, as the reasonable and beneficial norm. Similarly, many white people in the United States might find #Black Lives Matter overly confrontational, but they take it for granted that black people can vote, and that whites-only primaries and officially segregated schools are wrong, racist, and a thing of the past. And, despite their own continued contributions to maintaining de facto structural racism, they would not accept an official return to the apartheid of Jim Crow laws. That is why reversing the gains of the two most successful movements, labor and civil rights, has required a sustained, multi-decade, multi-front campaign by the corporate class. The global trade rules that corporate elites methodically put into place have been a key strategy. From the 1970s through the 1990s, they gutted the power of U.S. factory workers, the biggest organized labor force of that time, by putting them in direct competition with workers earning $1 a day in countries where rights are minimal and repression high. Then they started a drumbeat about unionized workers in the United States being overpaid, and rallied national opinion to that message. This is but one example of how people, in this case the corporate class, can change what academics call the opportunity structure to suit their long-term goals. Global and regional trade accords also give multinational corporations the right to buy land anywhere in almost any country, and new corporate landlords have forcibly evicted or cheaply bought off millions of people from self-sustaining plots of land, directly contributing to a huge rise in immigration into the United States and Europe. 8. During the same decades, the corporate class pocketed the courts, one judicial appointment at a time. The resulting deeply conservative judiciary has relentlessly chipped away at the major laws sustaining the victories of labor and civil rights, overturning hard-fought, key provisions of affirmative action and voting rights protections. Moreover, along with austerity and privatization, conservative courts have facilitated a vertically integrated for-profit prison system, resulting in the mass incarceration of African Americans, detention centers overflowing with Latinos, and massive profits for the putrid penal system's corporate shareholders. 9. The corporate class also created their version of a popular front, seizing the cultural apparatus through such rulings as the Federal Communications Commission's Clinton-era decision to allow multinationals to outright own the means of communication. They also build up, through very generous funding, the powerful Christian right. In the zigzag of forward progress from the 1930s to the early 1970s, followed by defeats from the mid-1970s to the present time, what changed? Why were the achievements won during the heyday of the pre-McCarthy labor movement and the civil rights movement so substantial compared with the progressive achievements of the past 40 years? Scholars and practitioners alike have numerous answers to these questions, overwhelmingly structural in nature. But in most of their answers they consider the labor movement as a separate phenomenon with little relationship to the civil rights movement. Social scientists have approached the study of each as if they were different species, one a mammal and the other a fish, one earthbound and one aquatic. Yet these movements have shared several key features that argue for understanding them as more alike than distinct. The main difference between these two most powerful movements half a century ago and today is that during the former period of their great successes they relied primarily on, and were led by, what Francis Fox Piven has eloquently termed ordinary people. They had a theory of power. It came from their own ability to sustain massive disruptions to the existing order. Today, as Theta Skocpol documents in Diminished Democracy, from membership to management in American civic life, attempts to generate movements are directed by professional, highly educated staff who rely on an elite, top-down theory of power that treats the masses as audiences of, rather than active participants in, their own liberation. Aiming to speak for, and influence, masses of citizens, droves of new national advocacy groups have set up shop, with the media amplifying debates among their professional spokespersons. The National Abortion Rights Action League debates the national right to life. Committee, the Concord Coalition takes on the American Association for Retired Persons, and the Environmental Defense Fund counters business groups. Ordinary Americans attend to such debates fitfully, entertained or bemused. Then pollsters call at dinnertime to glean snippets of what everyone makes of it all. 10. As the cases in this book, all situated in the new millennium, illustrate, the chief factor in whether or not organizational efforts grow organically into local and national movements capable of effecting major change is where and with whom the agency for change rests. It is not merely if ordinary people, so often referred to as the grassroots, are engaged, but how, why, and where they are engaged. Advocacy, mobilizing, and organizing. Here is the major difference among the three approaches discussed in the book. Advocacy doesn't involve ordinary people in any real way. Lawyers, pollsters, researchers, and communications firms are engaged to wage the battle. Though effective for forcing car companies to install seatbelts or banishing toys with components that infants might choke on, this strategy severely limits serious challenges to elite power. Advocacy fails to use the only concrete advantage ordinary people have over elites: large numbers. In workplace strikes, at the ballot box, or in nonviolent civil disobedience, strategically deployed masses have long been the unique weapon of ordinary people. The 1% have a vast armory of material resources and political special forces, but the 99% have an army. Over the past 40 years, a newer mechanism for change seekers has proliferated: the mobilizing approach. Mobilizing is a substantial improvement over advocacy, because it brings large numbers of people to the fight. However, too often they are the same people, dedicated activists who show up over and over at every meeting and rally for all good causes, but without the full mass of their coworkers or community behind them. This is because a professional staff directs, manipulates, and controls the mobilization. The staffers see themselves, not ordinary people, as the key agents of change. To them, it matters little who shows up, or why, as long as a sufficient number of bodies appear, enough for a photo good enough to tweet and maybe generate earned media. The committed activists in the photo have had no part in developing a power analysis. They aren't informed about that or the resulting strategy, but they dutifully show up at protests that rarely matter to power holders. The third approach, organizing, places the agency for success with a continually expanding base of ordinary people, a mass of people never previously involved, who don't consider themselves activists at all. That's the point of organizing. In the organizing approach, specific injustice and outrage are the immediate motivation, but the primary goal is to transfer power from the elite to the majority, from the 1% to the 99%. Individual campaigns matter in themselves, but they are primarily a mechanism for bringing new people into the change process and keeping them involved. The organizing approach relies on mass negotiations to win, rather than the closed-door deal-making typical of both advocacy and mobilizing. Ordinary people help make the power analysis, design the strategy, and achieve the outcome. They are essential and they know it. In unions and SMOs in the United States today, advocacy and, especially, mobilizing prevail. This is the main reason why modern movements have not replicated the kinds of gains achieved by the earlier labor and civil rights movements. Table 1.1 compares the three models by their distinct approach to power, strategy, and people. Hari Hahn has a somewhat similar chart in her excellent book How Organizations Develop Activists. 11. However, Hahn focuses on what I call self-selecting groups that do not make class a central issue. This book does focus on class, and on the clear and vital distinction between the strategy of developing activists, who are not always drawn from the working class, and that of developing organic leaders, who always are. Table 1.1 Options for Change. Structure-based versus self-selecting groups. The labor and civil rights movements were located in the landscape of what I call structure-based organizing. The structures were, respectively, the workplace and the black church under Jim Crow. Both movements chose organizing as their primary strategy. Mobilizing and advocacy also played a role, but the lifeblood of these movements was mass participation by ordinary people, whose engagement was inspired by a cohesive community bound by a sense of place. The working community on the shop floor, in the labor movement, and the faith community in the church, in the fight for civil rights. The empirical research that follows and the voluminous literature examining the outcomes of the 1930s through 1960s are fair grounds for arguing that structure-based organizing still offers the best chance to rebuild a powerful progressive movement. Unorganized workplaces and houses of faith remain a target-rich environment, and there are plenty of them, enough to return the labor movement to the 35% density it had when inequality was falling, not rising. 12. Since organizing's primary purpose is to change the power structure away from the 1% to more like the 90%, majorities are always the goal. The more people, the more power. But not just any people. And the word majority isn't a throwaway word on a flip chart, it is a specific objective that must be met. In structure-based organizing, in the workplace, and in faith-based settings, it is easy to assess whether or not you have won over a majority of the participants in the given structure to a cause or an issue. A workplace or church will have, say, 500 workers or parishioners, and to reach a majority, or even a supermajority, the quantifiable nature of the bounded constituency allows you to assess your success in achieving your numbers. An organizer intending to build a movement to maximum power who is approaching a structured or bounded constituency must target and plan to reach each and every person, regardless of whether or not each and every person has any pre-existing interest in the union or community organization. Beyond understanding concretely when a majority has been gained, the organizer can gauge the commitment levels of the majority by the nature, frequency, and riskiness of actions they are willing to take. The process of building a majority and testing its commitment level also allows a far more systematic method of assessing which ordinary people have pre-existing leadership within the various structures, a method called leadership identification. These informal leaders, whom I will call organic leaders, seldom self-identify as leaders and rarely have any official titles, but they are identifiable by their natural influence with their peers. Knowing how to recognize them makes decisions about whom to prioritize for leadership development far more effective. Developing their leadership skill set is more fruitful than training random volunteers, because these organic leaders start with a base of followers. They are the key to scale. This process differs considerably from the self-selecting that goes on in movement work, such as environmental and other single-issue fights, women's and other identity-based movements, and non-religious community efforts. Self-selecting groups rely on the mobilizing approach, and many of these groups grew out of, or in response to, the New Left project of the 1960s. 13 In self-selecting work, most people show up at meetings because they have a pre-existing interest in or serious commitment to the cause. As Skocpol says, many of the key groups were not membership associations at all. They were small combinations of nimble, fresh thinking, and passionate advocates of new causes. 14 In self-selecting work, movement groups spend most of their time talking to people already on their side, whereas in structure-based work, because the goal is building majorities of a bounded constituency, organizers are constantly forced to engage people who may begin with little or no initial interest in being a part of any group. In fact, in the beginning of a unionization campaign, many workers see themselves as opposed to the very idea of forming a union, just as many parishioners may be opposed to a more collective action orientation in their church when first approached about joining or helping to build a new faith-based group. Consequently, organizers and the organic leaders they first identify and then devote most of their time to winning over people who do not self-identify as being, with progressives. Structure-based organizing deliberately and methodically expands the base of people whom mobilizers can tap in their never-ending single-issue campaigns. Hahn's book reinforces my argument that self-selecting groups develop an activist-based approach, whereas structure-based groups develop a strong, more scalable grassroots base, because they focus on developing organic leaders who themselves can mobilize to reach majorities. Unions is the hardest test of social movement success. There are very significant factors, however, that differentiate union and faith-based efforts, despite each being structure-based. The best lessons emerge from success in the hardest tests. Real union fights are always high threat and high risk, as were the fights of the civil rights movement. 15 A crucial distinction is that most faith and broad-based organizations are known as O of Os, that is, organizations of organizations. The O of Os more often than not are religious entities, individual churches, synagogues, and mosques, and the initial recruitment happens between an organizer and the leader, who in this model is an official, generally full-time position holder, typically a person with a title that confers a more formal style of leadership: priest, minister, rabbi, imam. Once that more formal leader has been won over to the project of building a broad, faith-based organization, he or she gives the organizer full access to the congregation. Today's organizers of faith-based groups don't face conditions anything like today's union organizers. There's no well-funded effort to prevent them from engaging individual people of faith in their effort to win over a majority of the flock. On the contrary, faith-based organizers are generally welcomed with open arms. 16. When the structure is the workplace, the official leader of that structure, the company's chief executive, declares war on the employees at the first hint of a unionization effort, using tactics that often include threatening to fire any worker who talks with the organizers. 17 Organizers, whether paid professionals or volunteers from another, already organized facility, are forbidden by law from entering an unorganized workplace. This alone is a radical difference from faith-based settings. It means union organizers have to be really good at the art of what is called the one-on-one conversation, often the first engagement between organizers and potential recruits. There also isn't a do-or-die hard assessment of whether or not faith-based organizers have succeeded in winning a majority of congregants, since there are no government-supervised elections in each church to reveal the number of new organization members. Dues collection, through tithing, incentivizes faith-based organizers to push for as many new members as possible, but the legal structures around union organizing make winning a majority in a union election or strike a matter of absolute necessity. Timing and urgency also matter. Faith-based organizations do not have externally imposed deadlines, unionization efforts do. The Byzantine legal structure that dictates the rules for union formation and union governance imposes multiple deadlines, like so many obstacles to be overcome, starting with the union membership card, which expires in 12 months if the required level of unionization has not been won in that period. If unionization is won, then the clock is reset. A first collective agreement or contract must then be achieved, again within 12 months. Collective agreements themselves expire, triggering another round of deadlines. Faith-based organizing has no such exigencies, and faith-based organizers and organizations often take several years to build to something like an initial majority or to take a first action. 18. For all of these reasons, union organizers, much more than faith-based organizers, must hone their skills in identifying organic leaders, persuading constituents, and developing what union organizers call structure tests. Of course, since the McCarthy era, most unions haven't even attempted to organize unorganized workers, run strikes, or win high-participation contract ratification votes. 19. This book's purpose is to draw lessons for power building from the best examples of success under the most difficult conditions. This book is not about union organizing, it is about organizing. That unions are the focus is a hint to social scientists and the intelligentsia that the failure to study or understand unions as social movements has resulted in a lack of understanding of the most effective way to build power. In the new millennium, as in the past, meaningful union success requires building to majorities in the workplace, a setting that does represent the most difficult conditions. As Dan and Mary Ann Clausen said, mechanisms in union organizing offer social movement scholars an underused resource: the opportunity for systematic study of widely practiced, and often highly risky, forms of collective action. 20. It sometimes seems there is a forged, collective resistance to seeing the best of labor organizing today as being every bit as moral, legitimate, and strength-producing as the 60-year-old civil rights movement. Charles Payne illustrates this indirectly in the preface to the 2007 edition of his masterful book on organizing in the civil rights movement, while commenting on the many reviews of his book. By far, the chapter In Light of Freedom which has been least commented upon by reviewers is Chapter 12 with its discussion of various corruptions within the movement. 21. When the discussion is about the labor movement, the reverse is almost always true. The focus seems to be mostly on internal corruption and rarely on the movement's moral crusade for worker dignity in a viciously anti-worker economy. Yet high-participation organizing under high-risk conditions, using high moral standards, has continued. The lessons abound. New Labor's response to the crisis of the union movement. Unions in the United States are experiencing a profound crisis. In 1995, the biggest shakeup in the U.S. labor movement in more than 50 years took place when a new generation of unionists forced the first contested election in the history of the American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organizations, AFL-CIO. The victors, called the New Voices slate, promised revitalization through aggressive new organizing. 2 decades and hundreds of millions of dollars later, union ranks had declined even more, from 10.3% to 6.7% in the private sector and from 14.9% to 11.3% overall. 22 The unions aligned with the elections winning team were mostly service workers unions, and I will refer to them throughout this book as New Labor. 23 Why has New Labor failed to reverse the decline of union power? U.S. unions are not monolithic. Most unions have not been trying to organize the unorganized. Mostly, they've been managing their own decline. 24 In 1995, though, one set of unions declared they would reverse the tide of their ebbing membership. This book focuses on that set of unions. The grouping is slightly porous but contains a core that self-identify as unions trying to change and grow their ranks. I rely on several intersecting groups of unions to constitute the universe I investigate, a list generated by Kate Bronfenbrenner, one that she used in her enormous body of union research. The list on the winning side of the AFL-CIO victory in 1995, the unions that broke from the AFL-CIO in 2006, known as the Change to Win, CTW unions, and, very recently, the 2 main national teachers unions, which have gone through significant leadership changes. Owing to the ferocious national attack on teachers, these 2 unions historically go-it-aloners that eschewed close ties to the larger House of Labor, have become active participants with other unions for the first time in decades. Dominated since 1995 by unions in the service sector, these overlapping lists include the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, Hotel Employees and Restaurant Employees, HERE, and Union of Needle Trades Employees, Unite, which merged to become Unite HERE, American Federation of State, County and Municipal Employees, AFSCME, United Food and Commercial Workers, UFCW, United Auto Workers, UAW United Brotherhood of Carpenters, UBC, Laborers International Union of North America LIUNA, the United Farm Workers UFW, the American Federation of Teachers, AFT, and the National Education Association, NEA. Who is in and out of the overlapping list depends on the exact months and years of various complicated turf wars. Although the external environment of all unions is extremely hostile, unions could be winning much more. The reasons for the ongoing decline of union membership lie mainly in how unions engage with their existing members and with unorganized workers. Despite its now decades-old rhetoric about organizing, New Labor mostly uses a mobilizing approach. Much labor history and analysis focus on external factors to explain union decline: the employer offensive, hostile courts, globalization, automation, and a changing employment structure, ignoring strategy and methods for engaging workers. This book focuses on something movement actors can actually and easily control: their own strategy. A critical factor in the failure of the union revitalization effort after 1995 has been the strategic choice made by key leaders of New Labor to move away from workers and the workplace. Because of adverse labor laws and unfriendly court rulings, these leaders decided they could no longer win traditional union elections. They shifted their strategy to securing so-called card check and neutrality deals and fair election procedure accords with employers. Such agreements are anchored in a core idea: getting the employers to stop fighting unionization. New labor unions invented new mechanisms for what they deemed carrots and sticks. Carrots included rewarding corporations by helping them increase their government subsidies and decrease their taxes, and also promising to cede control of the workplace and instead focus narrowly on wages and material benefits. If these carrots failed, there was the stick: the union's ability to impose potential costs on the employer. This might be done through a corporate campaign, including publicity offensives against the employer's brand and stockholder actions brand damage, by lobbying to have various public subsidies that flow into the so-called private sector decreased or cut off, by adding lawyers to press for environmental and other reviews, or by delaying or preventing zoning changes. Many of these tactics rely on politics, and so unions also invested more money in politics, not politics as in voters to the polls, but politics as in million-dollar check writing and backroom, gotcha, deals. Corporate collaboration isn't new, but when the labor-run corporate campaigns first developed in the 1970s as a response to the degeneration of worker protections under U.S. labor law, they were designed to complement worker organizing. By the early years of the new millennium, they had all but replaced at .25 the strategy of weakening employer opposition to union organization through corporate campaigns made employers, not workers or their communities, the primary focus of New Labor's energy. Today, corporate campaigns continue to locate the fight in the economic arena by threatening to disrupt profit-making, but not through workers withholding their labor. Instead, a new army of college-educated professional union staff bypass the strike and devise other tactics to attack the employer's bottom line. New Labor's over-reliance on corporate campaigns has resulted in a war waged between labor professionals and business elites. Workers are no longer essential to their own liberation. New Labor's leaders, many of whom self-identify and are seen as progressives outside the union sector itself, have rationalized carrots and accords reached with big business that have stripped workers and their communities of the tools to defend themselves against their employers. 26. Moreover, New Labor's adoption and fetishizing of corporate tactics stands in contrast to the organizing style at the root of many of labor's great victories, won during an even more hostile period of industrial relations than that of the past 4 decades, the 1930s, which saw the successful establishment of the unions of the Congress of Industrial Organization (CIO). A key aspect of the CIO organizers' craft was identifying organic worker leaders in the shop and anchoring campaigns in the whole worker, understood to be a person embedded in a range of social relationships in the workplace and in the community. 27. The loss of the strength gained through whole worker organizing was one serious consequence of the alliance of business unionism with McCarthyism, which drove most organizers skilled in the CIO-era method out of the labor movement. Today, like World War II veterans, many CIO veterans have died, leaving few to tell their war stories. On the heels of the McCarthy era, union leaders adopted an increasingly accommodationist strategy that for a few decades achieved material gains and union security, but at the price of surrendering the option to strike and, often, all other real rights on the shop floor. Once the production-crippling strike weapon was abandoned, union leaders no longer saw a need to build a strong worksite-based organization among a majority of workers, one powerful enough that a majority decides to walk off the job, united, together, with common goals. New labor doubled down on strategies that involved fewer and fewer workers, reinforcing instead of challenging the mistakes of the generation of leaders they replaced. As a result, wage increases and improvements in working conditions have come to a halt. Workers as the primary leverage of their own salvation have been replaced by the corporate campaign, a method of tactical warfare that takes union action away from the shop floor and away from the rank and file. The search for black swans, unions that still run successful. Majority strikes. Workers can still win substantial victories by building and holding majority participation, a very different strategy from the one deployed by new labor or any national groups today. Because the most powerful strikes, those that shut down or cripple production, rely not on staff but on an overwhelming majority of workers to engage in collective action. The use of labor's strongest weapon requires an approach to workers that facilitates majority participation in the union. The preponderance of cases I examine in this book involve successful majority strikes carried out since 2000. Drawing an analogy to the industrial era factory of the past, but updating the shop floors and the workforces that occupy them, I focus on cases in the dominant industries of today's service economy, healthcare and education, both fields in which many workers with a wide range of skill and education constantly collaborate in the same buildings. Unlike those of the past, the workforces in my case studies are mostly comprised of women, many of them women of color, and in the work they do, emotional labor and technical skill are equally crucial to success. The transition from a manufacturing to a service economy radically altered traditional worker-consumer relations. Are there strategy implications here for unions? Does the strike strategy of a female-dominated, service-oriented workforce look different from the old one? Does labor need to view the public differently in contemporary strike strategy? Does the relationship between these workers and their patients or students, and the patients' and students' families, demand a different relationship between the workers' unions and the community? Yes to all. Strikes are essential to restoring the power of the working class, not just for the better standards strikes can produce, but also because they reveal high participation organizing. Unions still successfully engaging in massive strikes, not simply protests borrowing the name strike, are concrete proof of highly successful methods that can challenge the root of all inequality, the inequality of power in society. The corporate class has been driving a wedge between the public and unionized workers. Now the public in our neoliberal service-heavy economy must become an extension of the workers in the fight against the employers. The stories in this book tell how to restore strikes to prominence again in the United States, and demonstrate that doing so successfully will depend on labor adopting a radically different relationship with workers and the consuming public, a relationship that can only be built by the workers themselves. These case studies represent a small section of union and community organizing. They include some failures, but most demonstrate successes won in a period of massive decline for both unions and civil society. My aim is not to produce a theory that explains successes and failures in toto, but rather to explain in depth the dynamics, strategies, and contexts in which particular victories were achieved. Understanding these successes is key to rethinking and revitalizing a powerful progressive movement in the US 28. The 12 post-2000 cases I analyze involve one classic SMO, 2 national unions, and 2 local unions, one of them a local of one of the nationals, an outlier with an approach very different from its parent. The unions span the so-called private and public sectors. The distinction is a strategic frame more than a reality. The cases involve trade jobs and service jobs, filled by workers harder to replace teachers and nurses and easier to replace factory hands, teachers' aides, nurses' aides, cooks, and cleaners. One case involves a mostly male workforce of diverse backgrounds, slaughtering and preparing pork in a right-to-work southern state. Others involve mostly female workforces, teaching and caring for the young and tending to the sick and infirm in at least partly unionized northern states. Multiple cases originated within each of these organizations. In one of the national unions, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, UFCW, 3 separate campaigns to unionize workers in the same factories spanning more than a decade resulted in 2 defeats and 1 big victory. In all of the cases, losing and winning a little or a lot can be correlated with one common factor: the beliefs and motivations, or purposefulness, of the leadership team. 29 Table 1.2 provides a summary of the cases. Table 1.2 Cases in the New Millennium, 2000 to 2014 *. The 2 losses came in 1994 and 1997. Methodology: I employ mixed qualitative and quantitative methods. I conducted 58 semi-structured interviews with rank and file workers, civil society leaders, members of local media organizations, current and former lead strategists in the campaigns, and longtime active as well as retired union leaders and organizers. I analyzed data sets from the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Services, FMCS, work stoppage databases from the year 2000 to present. I did archival research on each case's strategic planning documents, analysis of the current collective bargaining agreements of each local union, read published newspaper stories and internal memos, and I conducted a line-by-line content analysis of the key Saul Alinsky texts as well as the organizing training manuals of numerous Alinskyist organizations and unions. I utilized participant observation for Chapter 3. First as a young organizer being apprenticed at 1199 New England and later as National Deputy Director for SEIU's Healthcare Division, where I participated in numerous discussions leading up to the launch of what became known nationally as the Nursing Home Industry Alliance, which the Washington State case represents. I was trained as a community organizer in one strand of the Alinsky tradition prior to my years as a labor organizer and contract negotiator. Relying on what John Gehring's 30 calls crucial cases, I interrogate the relationship between rank and file worker agency and success. Gehring describes crucial cases as paradigmatic, and within each of the 4 chapters I deploy the crucial case method, the approach to nursing homes in Washington State versus Connecticut, the achievements of one worker center, make the road New York as against all other worker centers, the massive and defiant strike by Chicago's teachers in a period defined by surrender by most teachers' unions, the abuse of labor law by one employer in the Deep South. The chapters. Chapter 2 dissects the relationship between power and strategy and goes deeper into comparing and contrasting what have become 2 distinct approaches to social change, the dominating mobilizing approach and the underused organizing approach. I propose a blended approach called whole worker organizing. This approach is informed by the stories in this book as well as my own experiences. It tightly integrates workplace and non-workplace issues, action, and learning in a holistic strategy. It responds to an attempt to overcome the challenge posed by Ira Katznelson in City Trenches. American urban politics has been governed by boundaries and rules that stress ethnicity, race, and territoriality, rather than class, and that emphasize the distribution of goods and services, while excluding questions of production or workplace relations. The centerpiece of these rules has been the radical separation in people's consciousness, speech, and activity of the politics of work from the politics of community. Author emphasis 31. Whole worker organizing, laid out in Chapter 2 and depicted in some aspects in all the subsequent empirical chapters, demonstrates that where unions understand their members and unorganized workers to be class actors in their communities, and when the workers systematically bring their own pre-existing community networks into their workplace fights, workers still win, and their wins produce a transformational change in consciousness. Chapter 3 takes 2 similarly situated union locals, members of the same national union, SEIU, and examines the wildly different strategies each deploys in private sector nursing homes. One local represents the best expression of Andrew Stern, whom the national media for years called the leading figure of New Labor and whose imprint still dominates the Washington State local's present culture and strategies and those of the national union. The national media has begun to reify David Rolfe, Stern's protege at the Washington local, as the new future of labor, despite his many public pronouncements that he thinks unions are a 20th century concept. The other local is an outlier of the national SEIU and represents the past militant traditions of the CIO. The local is commonly known as District 1199 New England, a local through which workers in more than 100 nursing homes have waged strikes in the new millennium. This chapter lays bare the differences among the advocacy, mobilizing, and organizing approaches in the workplace, and demonstrates the superiority of the latter. Chapter 4 analyzes the history of the Chicago Teachers Union (CTU). During the quarter century from 1988 to the union's recent strike in 2012, a strike that captivated the nation. I show the CTU's slow and steady decline from a once mighty union, even in 1988, into a fairly typical weak, unimaginative organization that had lost the faith of many of the best teachers. I then trace the evolution of the steps that those disillusioned teachers took to rebuild their union to beat one of the nation's most powerful mayors at that time, Rahm Emanuel, who set out to break the CTU in the context of a broader and bipartisan assault on public sector unions. Chapter 4 shows how quickly a union can go from decline to renewal and the profound difference between a union leadership that enables the rank and file to fight and a leadership that uses staff as dutiful administrators in a top-down union that constrains the will of its own members. Chapter 5 returns to the private sector, the case of a big factory much like the factories that dominated the 20th century. Most academics have long assumed organizing the unorganized might be possible among low-wage service workers, but this chapter, like the others, demonstrates that motivation and strategy may have more to do with failure and success across all sectors of workers than previously thought. This is a case study of the world's largest pork production facility, a Smithfield Foods plant in rural North Carolina, the state with the lowest rate of unionization in the United States. The workers are mostly men, and racial and ethnic tensions among them are exploited so profoundly, it is hard to believe Jim Crow is not still alive legally as well as culturally. The workers in this factory are twice defeated in their attempts at unionization. On the third try, they win, and win big, bringing massive change to plant operations and to their own lives. Their story suggests a path forward for other large manufacturing plants in the South, a path where workers unite their workplace and community relationships into a single struggle for decency and respect. Chapters 3, 4, and 5 all provide evidence that when a union strategically engages the broader community, new and strong leaders develop within and outside the factory walls. They also show that Robert Michals's iron law of oligarchy isn't actually iron, and suggest that the motivation and/or ideology of key leadership is a crucial factor in whether or not a union turns oligarchic. Additionally, all three chapters show that there are key structural features that can institutionalize governance models that help to thwart oligarchic tendencies in large organizations like unions. Chapter 6 explores a group that organizes the working class as a class, but is not itself a union. Make the Road New York is a social movement organization that is also a worker center, but it locates the worker center inside an organization that has managed to come as close to a modern union as any non-union group in the United States today. With over 155 full-time staff, the organization combines direct services, advocacy, and mobilizing into a tight blend, and it has enjoyed more success than most similarly situated groups. Interestingly, many of the group's specific legislative victories, as well as their workplace efforts, largely rely on the continued strength of New York City's unions. While their work is impressive, it raises a fundamental question of whether groups like this can continue producing wins if the unions they rely on, which exist as key players in only a handful of states, get weaker. The concluding chapter sums up the lessons of the case studies and argues that to reverse today's inequality requires a robust embrace of unions, but of unions that are democratic, focused on bottom-up rather than top-down strategies, and place the primary agency for change in workers acting collectively at work and in the communities in which they reside. The losses of the past 50 years, decades when the corporate right seized firm control of the power structure, can be recouped, but only by readopting and modernizing the methods and strategies deployed by the old CIO and the civil rights movement. 2. The power to win is in the community, not the boardroom. Part of the legacy of people like Ella Baker and Septima Clark is a faith that ordinary people who learn to believe in themselves are capable of extraordinary acts, or, better, of acts that seem extraordinary to us precisely because we have such an impoverished sense of the capabilities of ordinary people. If we are surprised at what these people accomplished, Our surprise may be a commentary on the angle of vision from which we view them. That same angle of vision may make it difficult to see that of the gifts they brought to the making of the movement, courage may have been the least. Charles Payne, I've Got the Light of Freedom 1. The United States has undergone profound changes since the era of the CIO. Yet today, the unions whose strategies most closely resemble the old CIOs, the unions that still use the strike weapon, are also the unions whose members are negotiating, and gaining, contracts with life-altering improvements. Many of them are situated in the new service economy, which is dominated by women, often women of color. These workers understand that their jobs can't easily be shipped abroad or automated, yet. But even these unions, the nation's best, are missing a crucial piece of classic CIO strategy, and if they want to continue to use the strike weapon, they are going to need it. The CIO's organizing methods were deeply embedded in, and reliant on, an understanding of workers in relationship to the communities in which they lived. Rhetorically and tactically, unions today that follow the methods of the old CIO understand that the community is important, but they fail to see their members' organic ties to their communities strategically. This chapter begins by showing why a more transformational model for working with the broader community is so important today, and ends with a theory and strategy for how this work can be done, called whole worker organizing. Sandwiched between the why and how of deep community engagement is a focused discussion about the difference between organizing and mobilizing, the evolution of the mobilizing model, and why each approach produces different levels of power. The schematic showing power in relationship to strategy is built on Joseph Luders's work on concession and disruption costs in his book The Civil Rights Movement and the Logic of Social Change. Point 2. Today's service worker has a radically different relationship to the consuming public than last century's manufacturing worker had. People buying a car don't meet and confer with the workers whose hands create it. They don't walk up and down the assembly line insisting that a tweak this way or that might make a better ride. But parents picking their kids up from school often meet with the people who spend more waking hours with their kids than they do, the educators who are helping their children prepare intellectually and socially for adulthood. And parents participate in the educators' production process, attending meetings and volunteering in the classroom. Similarly, nurses and other health care workers charged with repairing the victim of a car crash are in constant contact with the family, who are also allowed in the workplace, that is, the patient's hospital room. The case studies in the following chapters are filled with evidence that these mostly female, multiracial service workers are as capable of building powerful organizations as they are of building a child's mind or rebuilding a patient's body. In fact, they are among the only workers today engaging in production shuttering strikes. Their organic ties to the broader community form the potential strategic wedge needed to leverage the kind of power American workers haven't had for decades. In large swaths of the service economy, the point of production is the community. Working on community issues isn't social movement unionism, it is simply unionism. As for the large number of manufacturing workers still in the United States, often situated in the under-regulated, non-union South, this book offers case evidence that those who rely more on the CIO-era methodology, a bottom-up model in which workers have primary agency and are understood to be their own lever of liberation, can also win life-altering improvements. They can do it by systematically structuring their many strong connections, family, religious groups, sports teams, hunting clubs, into their campaigns. That a more organic relationship with the public exists for some workers, such as mission-driven service workers, doesn't mean that only they should tether their quality of life to that of the broader community. All workers, whether their shop floor is a call center or a factory, can tell the story of their overstressed work situation, ordinarily not seen by the consumer, but certainly understood by the rest of the working class. Solidarity among human beings can happen spontaneously, as in a flood or fire, or by design, through organizing. Service workers tend to be less structurally powerful economically in the workplace than the mostly male workers of the CIO era, because it is easier to replace them and because when they do strike, not only the employer but also the consumer immediately feels the repercussions of their collective action. But they are more structurally powerful when it comes to engaging their community in a fight. For today's service workers to restore the strike, still the most effective lever available to the working class, the additional power source they need is not a corporate campaign or funds for bigger political donations, but rather a more systematic way to merge workplace and non-workplace issues. There is enormous value to this approach, starting with the political education it offers. Plenty of CEOs whose workplace policies hurt workers on the job also serve on local and regional boards, commissions, and task forces whose public policies hurt the same workers at home and in their neighborhoods, for example, by promoting development schemes that displace working-class renters and homeowners and the shopkeepers they rely on. Workers who understand how corporate power is wielded both in the workplace and outside it can strengthen themselves in both spheres and carry the fight into both, tapping their social and community networks, including key people with access and influence, such as religious leaders. To rebuild a base powerful enough to seriously push back against the economic and political crises strangling most workers today, unions will have to practice the best organizing methods both inside and outside the workplace, simultaneously, in a seamless, unified approach. A bifurcated union and community alliance, which is what Richard Trumka promoted at the quadrennial convention of the AFL-CIO in 2013, will not be as effective, because the groups Trumka proposed to ally with and that most unions do engage are too weak themselves to make any real difference. Maintaining the bifurcation that has existed for the past 40 years also denies agency to today's heavily female workforce. Women have long understood that issues such as child care, good housing, quality schools, clean drinking water, safe streets, and an end to mass incarceration and police violence are every bit as important as higher wages to the well-being of workers and their families. Understanding how to frame a more integrated approach that covers these needs requires further clarity about, and a little history of, the differences between mobilizing and organizing. Many methods used in successful organizing today had their origins in the struggles of the CIO in the first half of the last century. Certainly, the most successful organizing described in this book draws heavily on methods first developed in the steel, auto, coal, and other heavy industry sectors. The CIO from its founding in 1935 was grounded on the principle that all workers, skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled, who worked in the same industries and for the same employer should be brought together in one union. 3 In fact, it was founded in response to the refusal of the American Federation of Labor (AFL) to unify all workers regardless of skill level. After the early, enormous success of the CIO, the AFL eventually agreed to unionize workers the same way, though its chief motivation may have been expedience, inclusiveness adopted as a defense mechanism rather than a core principle. 4. Modern organizing methods, the CIO's legacy. Most CIO organizing was based on a mass collective action, high participation model anchored in deep worker solidarities and cooperative engagement in class struggle. Strikes, the kind that could shut down production, strikes in which most if not all workers walk off the job in a high-risk collective action, were routine, and were evidence that workers themselves were the primary agents of their own liberation. Left organizers, those associated with various socialist and radical factions, flocked to the CIO because of the principle of inclusion, of uniting all workers across ethnicity, gender, race, skill level, and every other working class division. The AFL had a long, complicated history not just of excluding semi- and unskilled workers, and black workers, but also of having taken positions against European and then Asian immigration, and very narrowly limiting the union struggle to wages and working conditions. 5. The CIO's left organizers were intensely committed to recruiting and building power across the many isms and other divisions among the working class, and they had to develop special methods to do it. Jack Odell, an organizer for the CIO and later for the civil rights movement, recalls their success. "I grew up in Detroit, and when people asked you, 'What union are you in?' the guys didn't even say their union. They just said, 'The CIO.' Especially black workers, because the CIO would take on racism." 6. Nelson Lichtenstein's State of the Union, A Century of American Labor. 7. Judith Stepan Norris and Maurice Zeitlin's Left Out, Reds and Americas. Industrial Unions, 8 and Saul Alinsky's John L. Lewis, an unauthorized biography. 9 All document that the left-wing organizers were the CIO's best All of these authors record at length how the head of the CIO, John L. Lewis, though a fierce anti-communist and anti-socialist, relied heavily if not primarily on organizers from the left to win the hardest organizing drives and the biggest strikes. Alinsky describes how Lewis hired these organizers as a pragmatic expedient and was confident he could control them. Today, people associate the name Reuther with the heyday of the United Auto Workers. As Alinsky himself points out, it wasn't the Reuther brothers, Walter, of great fame, or his brothers, Victor and Roy, who principally helped auto workers form their union, though they played a part. When Lewis turned to help the auto workers, he saw that they were being organized and led by leftists. The leaders and organizers of the UAW group in General Motors were the left-wingers, Wyndham Mortimer and Robert Travis. These two built the union inside the great General Motors empire. If Lewis wanted to take the auto workers into the CIO, he had to take in their left leadership. 10. Earlier, Alinsky describes how the inept AFL had destroyed the hopes and dreams of the auto workers in 1933 and 1934, which set the stage for Lewis and the new CIO to do what the AFL wouldn't and couldn't. When the auto workers, filled with disgust, built bonfires with their AFL membership cards, it was the left-wingers mainly who kept fighting against the disillusionment and cynicism that swept the workers. It was they who kept organizing and organizing and organizing and organizing. 11. Later, Alinsky describes how Lewis failed in almost every organizing effort he attempted without the help of left organizers. 12. Stephen Norris and Zeitlin reinforce the same point in great detail. It was organizers on the left who were the most committed to overcoming class divisions, and who, through uniting workers, were able to help them withstand and defeat the fiercest employer opposition. All three of these books document that employer opposition in those days included physical attacks against workers, and even the strategic use of murder, which ought to help put today's employer offensives in perspective. Stephen Norris and Zeitlin devote a chapter to Lewis' dealings with the left. He would hire organizers out of the Communist Party, then purge them once they'd won the campaign. The chapter is titled for Lewis' famous quip about this tactic: "Who gets the bird, the hunter or the dog?" The authors provide a small mountain of evidence that the unions led by these leftist factions were not only the most effective but also the most democratic. Their well-constructed analysis demonstrates that many of the elements that Robert Michels argued were essential to prevent the development of oligarchy in an organization, democratic constitutions, internal caucuses, alternative newsletters, actually existed in these leftist unions that would later be obliterated by McCarthyism, not oligarchy. One left-led union they discuss is also the subject of Howard Kimmeldorf's Reds or Rackets? The Making of Radical and Conservative Unions on the Waterfront. Kimmeldorf analyzes the stark differences between two mostly male dockworkers unions, one on the East Coast and the other on the West Coast, that developed during the same period, the era of the CIO. On the East Coast, where workers and their leaders fought chiefly for money and other material gains, official corruption became legendary. Bribes served to buy off the Eastern unions for decades. On the West Coast, where the unions fought for control of production, that is, for the right to negotiate rules governing safety, hours, and similar issues, bribes didn't work. Money wasn't what these workers were looking for. The West Coast's wobbly inclined base produced a leader, Harry Bridges, who was openly a socialist. Bridges and the West Coast workers routinely engaged in strikes. They had to. Their demands were substantial and the employers weren't easy to beat. Kimmeldorf concludes that the endless class struggle in which the West Coast workers engaged resulted in high-quality contracts that cemented a high level of participation, active membership, and a strong relationship between the rank and file and the union leaders. He demonstrates that this left-wing leadership showed superior skill in every aspect of running a union, and notes that members routinely re-elected socialists to leadership positions, even though their own politics were not uniformly left-wing but instead quite diverse. What were the left's winning tactics? In a 1936 booklet, Organizing Methods in the Steel Industry, William Z. Foster writes, "Organizers do not know how to organize by instinct, but must be carefully taught." 13. He argues strongly for the importance of such training. The campaign can succeed only if thousands of workers can be organized to help directly in the enrollment of members. This work cannot be done by organizers alone. Very effective are small delegations of steel workers from one town or district to another and large mass delegations of workers from organized mills to unorganized mills. Other methods of drawing in new members included music and social affairs such as smokers, boxing matches, card parties, dances, picnics, various sports, etc., involving the workers and their wives. 14. The radicals in the CIO understood that workers were embedded in an array of important workplace and non-workplace networks, all of which could be best accessed, and, for organizing on a mass scale, only accessed by the workers themselves. Foster describes the list and chain systems 1930s terms for methods of building a network of the most respected workers inside and outside the workplace who could then mobilize their own networks. Unions that still run successful majority strikes today are that run and win. National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, elections in the private sector offer our closest look at the methods deployed by the leftists in the early CIO. Because union staffers in a private sector unionization effort are barred from entering the workplace, including its parking lots and cafeterias, they must master the old CIO craft of learning who the organic worker leaders are and persuading them to support the union. These organic leaders in turn can use their influence and are the best people to persuade their co-workers to join the struggle. The legal context of the private sector forces 100% worker agency. In these settings, the workers themselves are the only ones who can lead an inside campaign, which almost always must be waged in an extremely hostile climate. To connect to rank and file dynamics in the workplace, union organizers use a mechanism called organic leader identification, in which they analyze the workers' pre-existing social groups. This is done among the workers and in conversation with them, not apart from them. Workers themselves identify their organic leaders, who become the primary focus for full-time organizers. If these leaders are successfully recruited, they are taught the organizers' techniques, so that they can recruit their supporters on the shop floor, where outside organizers cannot go. Rarely, if ever, does a worker accurately announce himself or herself as a leader. Kristen Warner, a contemporary organizer in the CIO tradition, notes, "Organic leaders are almost never the workers who most want to talk with us. More often than not, they're the workers who don't want to talk to us and remain in the background. They have a sense of their value and won't easily step forward, not unless and until there's a credible reason. That's part of the character that makes them organic leaders." 16. These are the leaders needed for a serious struggle, such as a strike in which most workers must agree to walk off the job. In the CIO model, today as in the 1930s, strikes that cripple production are considered not only possible, but also the highest structure test of whether worker organization in a given facility is at its strongest. 17. It is the culmination of a series of tests that begin by measuring and assessing individual workers' power, and end by testing the power and collective organization of the workers worksite by worksite. A structure test typically used early in the process will gauge how effectively and efficiently a worker identified as an organic leader can get a majority of her shift or unit to agree to a public, and therefore high-risk, action, such as signing a public petition demanding that the employer recognize the union. This will be followed by increasingly challenging tests, considered confidence-building actions, such as getting workers to pose for individual or group photos for a public poster, or join in a sticker day, only considered a success if a supermajority of workers come to work wearing a union sticker or button. These are all high-risk actions. They announce to the manager that the workers participating are pro-union. Figure 2.1, an example of a structure test. Figure 2.1 below is an example of a majority petition, a document publicly signed by a majority of workers in a large workplace and then printed as a 3-by-5-foot poster to be marched by the workers themselves to the CEO. In this example, the workers are calling on management to settle their contract. If the worker leader given the assignment can turn this kind of action around in only 1 or 2 shifts, the organizer has correctly identified an organic leader. On the other hand, if a prospective worker leader, even one personally enthusiastic about the union, cannot get a majority of coworkers in his or her shift and unit to do anything quickly, let alone engage in high-risk actions, it is clear that the leadership identification was incorrect, and the organizer must start again, talking with all the workers to better assess which coworkers they most respect and will most willingly follow. The worker who fails at the test is likely a pro-union activist, not an organic leader, and leaders, not activists, win the campaign and have the capacity to build strong worksite structures. The process is not easy. Even a true organic leader sometimes fails to get a majority of signatures, often because of either weak personal commitment to the union or even active hostility toward it. If an organic leader remains undecided, the recruiting organizer, because of the urgency that always exists in high-risk union fights where the employer's war is either imminent or already in motion, takes the next step. Framing the hard choice. The process begins with understanding an individual organic leader's self-interest and helping the leader come to his or her own understanding, through face-to-face discussions, that this self-interest can only be realized through collective, not individual, action. That is, through a union. Because these organic leaders are often considered good workers by management, for the same reasons that their fellow workers trust and rely on them, they are often favored in small ways, for example, by being given desirable shifts. But they cannot win big things like pensions, sick pay, or maternity leave on their own. The organizer therefore carefully polarizes the conversation so that the worker understands he or she faces a clear and stark choice: take a risk in order to win the desired benefits, or be safe, do nothing, and get nothing. For example, a group of workers has identified Sally as the most influential rank-and-file person on their shift and in their work area. The organizer has successfully gotten Sally, in a one-on-one conversation, to explain that she is overwhelmed and frustrated by how much her employer automatically takes from her paycheck each month to pick up the cost of an expensive family health care plan. But she still hesitates when asked if she is willing to join up with her coworkers to form a union by signing this membership card. Sally knows that signing the card is a big decision. In the United States, employers routinely fire workers for taking such actions or punish them in other ways. A good organizer understands this, and at this point will say something like, "So, Sally, I want to be clear about what I am hearing. You are good with the boss continuing to charge you $440 per month, deducted from your paycheck, just to keep your kids healthy and you healthy enough to show up for work, for the rest of your life?" The best organizers in the CIO tradition call the moment that follows the long uncomfortable silence, because the organizer is trained to say nothing until the worker responds. And that can take several long minutes of dead silence between two people sitting face to face. The organizer respects that silence and waits it out, because the decision Sally is being asked to make is huge, and must be treated that way. Sally is not being lied to, she is not being promised anything, she is not being manipulated, and she is being advised that the employer will take swift and direct action against her and her coworkers. She is having a discussion about going on strike. This is worker agency. An axiom of organizers is that every good organizing conversation makes everyone at least a little uncomfortable. And it's a conversation that must be had. All other actions come from this one. Majority petitions, majority photo posters, majority sticker days, majority T-shirt days all serve multiple purposes. They are public activities, socializing workers to take a risk together. They are solidarity and confidence building, showing workers the strength of their numbers, and they are part of an endless series of assessments of the strength of each organic leader. For big units, at the beginning of an organizing drive or led up to a contract-related strike, these goals might take weeks to achieve. Only true organic leaders can lead their coworkers in high-risk actions. Pro-union activists without organic leaders are not effective enough, and professional staff organizers certainly cannot do it. They aren't even allowed into the workplace. The organic leader is essential to the organizing model. It took hundreds of thousands of Sallys to lead us out of inequality once, and it will take hundreds of thousands to do it again. Modern mobilizing methods, a product of McCarthyism, business unionism, and Saul Alinsky. If the organizing model is so effective, why was it so widely abandoned? Many factors contributed to the decimation of the labor movement's best organizers and the end of high participation unions. There were John Lewis' obsession with top-down power and his determination to reign in socialism, more important to him than reigning in corporations. There was the self-inflicted wounds of Stalinism and increasing divisions in the American left. There was World War II's peace treaty between labor and capital, which instituted strike bans, decreasing opportunities for rank and file on the job problem-solving, and centralized collective bargaining, disempowering rank and file-led negotiations. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 straitjacketed militants by banning solidarity strikes and forcing all unions and eventually all unionists to give an affidavit that they were not communists or affiliated with the left. The finishing blow was dealt by Joe McCarthy and his Cold War witch hunts. 18 These developments destroyed the most revolutionary aspect of the earlier CIO, the agency of workers themselves. Driving leftists out of the unions, the ones who kept organizing and organizing and organizing and organizing, 19 despite the stiffest odds, also drove out the methods of building strong worksite structures, the very kind that create high participation organizing. Marshall Gans, in Why David Sometimes Wins, 20 says the purpose or motivation of leadership teams is central to outcomes. The early CIO did use some full-time left-wing organizers. This was the Depression era, and many were either donating their time or being paid considerably less than today's full-time professionals. More importantly, the old CIO's full-time organizers were co-leaders with rank-and-file organizers, the organic leaders among the workers. This point will be explored in more depth in Chapter 3, in an examination of 1199 New England, a local union that serves as a good contemporary example of the CIO organizing method and its results. This union, composed of mostly female healthcare workers, routinely runs majority strikes, not without difficulty, but supermajority strikes were never easy. In their model, as in the early CIOs, the role of the paid organizer is to identify the organic leaders, recruit them, and coach them how to most effectively lead their coworkers against the inevitable employer war. Organizers in 1199 NE are understood to play a leadership role. They lead the organizing committee. The rank-and-file organizers lead the workers. Ganz's book documents a case involving farm workers similar to the dock workers case described in Kimmeldorf's Reds or Rackets. In Ganz's story, the same workforce is first defeated and later wins, but as in the case of the Western and Eastern dock workers, it is the approach to strategy and to the workers themselves that is decisive, not how many resources are brought to each unionization effort. As in Kimmeldorf's case, smarter demands, for more autonomy and control of the production process rather than for more money, lead to a smarter strategy, in which worker agency is primary to building the power needed to win. Ganz's and Kimmeldorf's in-depth studies reinforce a core argument in this book. What sociologists and academics have long labeled structure is actually human agency. Successful workplace organizers today who still run strikes regularly obsess about the two words structure test. But the structure these organizers are testing is simply worker agency, the power of the worker's own organization, built up and developed by individuals like Sally, organic leaders. In fact, all structure tests are agency tests. Global trade agreements are structure tests. They measure elite and corporate power. When a successful strike shuts down production and leads to a very strong contract for the striking workers, academics call that contract a structure. But the real structure involved is the human power, or agency, that won the contract. Good organizers today, like those depicted in the following chapters, make sure the workers know that their ability to win a great contract is in direct proportion to their ability and willingness to fight the employer, a test of the agency of one against the agency of the other. The left-wing organizers in the CIO who developed human structures powerful enough to defeat staggering inequalities, and who were committed to genuine worker agency, were replaced after World War II by a massive bureaucracy. Kim Moody and Nelson Lichtenstein document the expansion of professional union staff in the 1950s, an expansion that was later mimicked in social movements after the advent of the New Left at the end of the 1960s. 21 In her book Diminished Democracy, 22 Skocpol focuses on what she calls the extraordinary reorganization of U.S. civic life after the 1960s, seeking to make sense of the abrupt shift from membership-based voluntary associations to managerially directed advocacy groups. That shift was precipitated by the abrupt and massive shifts in unions. During every period Skocpol methodically analyzes, U.S. unions represented the largest sector of what she calls cross-class voluntary federations. The U.S. corporate class succeeded in taming unions by pushing for labor laws and regulations that encouraged or forced the replacement of workers and worker agency with a huge union bureaucracy, which they promised would promote the workers' interests better than could the workers themselves. Skocpol's abrupt shift emerged in part because the corporate class realized they could institute the same weakening mechanisms to quiet the unruly left wing growing outside the unions. A vast new philanthropic focus in the 1970s shifted from naming buildings to professionalizing protest. Social activism was legalized to death. Skocpol's exacting analysis of why democracy diminished when professionals replaced ordinary people can be applied in every respect to why democracy diminished in unions, though democracy decimated might be a more accurate way of putting it. One underexplored aspect of this effort to rationalize and contain agency is the role played by the man considered the dean or father of modern community organizing, Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky changes and compromises the organizing Model 23. Throughout the period that stretched from the CIO era to the civil rights movement and then into the 40 years Skocpol describes, Saul Alinsky was codifying the idea of community organizing. Weeks before his unexpected death, Alinsky described his project to Playboy in a wide-ranging interview, published posthumously, 24. What I wanted to try to do was to apply the organizing skills I'd mastered in the CIO to the worst slums and ghettos, so that the most oppressed and exploited elements could take control of their own communities and their own destinies. Up until then, specific factories and industries had been organized for social change, but never whole communities. 25. Alinsky, unfortunately, never truly mastered the CIO's organizing skills because he never did any workplace organizing himself. He was a mobilizer, outside the factories. In fact, Alinsky compromised the CIO organizing model in three significant ways that have weakened labor and non-labor movements alike. First, he delinked the method he observed from the mission or motivation of the left-wing organizers who were committed not only to winning campaigns but also to radically altering the power structure itself. He then grafted some of the method to an elite theory of power, and in so doing, he laid the groundwork for what I call the mobilizing model. Second, he was the bifurcator in chief. He proposed that unskilled, easily replaced workers in the community could, independently of their natural allies, the semi-skilled and skilled members of the working class, generate enough power outside of the economic arena to actually challenge the corporate class by themselves. Third, Alinsky, who idolized John Lewis, created an organizing model much more like Lewis than like that of the left-wing organizers upon whom the CIO was originally built. Alinsky ensured Lewis-like control of the masses through a fiction, still upheld today, that full-time organizers are not leaders and that they answer to the thousands of grassroots people they recruit, whom they call leaders. This fiction has obscured the accountability of the organizers for decades. Alinsky's core beliefs were recycled into the post-1995 New Labor leadership, creating a mobilizing model dressed up as an organizing model. Saul Alinsky's name has been synonymous with organizing for more than half a century. Though he died in 1972, shortly after the publication of his most famous book, Rules for Radicals, his influence today is everywhere. Both major candidates for the Democratic presidency in 2008, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and Clinton again in 2016, are linked to Alinsky's legacy. Clinton met with him and in 1969 wrote her undergraduate thesis on him, more than 100 pages examining what she calls the Alinsky Model. 26 During Obama's first presidential campaign, he spoke often about his experience working with an Alinsky-influenced community organization in Chicago. Since Obama came to power, perhaps because he did, Alinsky has been an inspiration to Tea Partiers, a development that has confounded many community organizers who consider themselves original, true Alinsky believers. In any casual internet search, after Wikipedia, the top 3 Alinsky hits are radical right websites, including Glenn Beck's, and these sites urge anyone serious about building power to read Rules for Radicals, a top seller in 2008 and 2009 among right-wing grassroots activists, whose leaders received gift copies from Dick Armey, among others. 27. Despite a world of differences between them, Saul Alinsky and Karl Marx have this in common: there is what they wrote, and what they did, and what has been done by their followers. There are Alinskyites and Marxists who denounce fellow Alinskyites and Marxists, insisting that other factions misunderstand the founder's true message. In both camps, devotees point to the good work that has been done by members of the tradition, and critics point to the ways the tradition has led the left into problems. Talking about Alinsky can be just as tricky as talking about Marx. The single biggest source of funding for 4 decades of community organizing, starting in the early 70s, was the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, CCHD. A long article by Lawrence Engel in Theological Studies 28 asserts, with copious evidence, that the CCHD was developed to support Alinsky's work. Engel's research describes the Catholic bishop's 1969 commitment to raise $50 million to alleviate poverty through a national collection strategy church by church. In today's dollars, this commitment to fund Alinsky-based work would be just over $330 million. 29 Engel asks, why would Catholic bishops approve funds for the poor to organize for power, much of which went to the community organizing projects associated with Saul Alinsky? 31 Answer to Engel's question is that the Catholic Church was sincere in hoping to alleviate poverty. Another comes from Alinsky himself. So in order to involve the Catholic priests in back of the yards, I didn't give them any stuff about Christian ethics, I just appealed to their self-interest. I'd say, look, you're telling your people to stay out of the communist-dominated unions and action groups, right? He'd nod. So, I'd go on, and what do? They say, yes, Father, and walk out of the church and join the CIO. Why? Because it's their bread and butter, because the CIO is doing something about their problems while you are just sitting here on your tail in the sacristy. That stirred him up, which is just what I wanted to do, And then I'd say, look, if you go on like that you're gonna alienate your parishioners, turn them from the church, maybe drive them into the arms of the Reds. Your only hope is to move first, to beat the communists at their own game, to show the people you're more interested in their living conditions than in the contents of your collection plate. And not only will you get them back again, by supporting their struggle, but when they win, they'll be more prosperous and your donations will go up and the welfare of the church will be enhanced. 31. Alinsky was replacing union dues with Catholic tithing, mediated by bishops instead of bosses. It's not hard to understand why Alinsky-based organizations have dominated the field since the 1970s. And it is important to understand their contributions, but also their limitations. To do that, it is important to understand Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky was born in Chicago in 1909 to two working-class Russian Jews. 32 In 1926, he entered the University of Chicago, where George Herbert Mead, credited with originating the field of symbolic interactionism, and sociologist Robert Park were significant intellectual powers. According to Alinsky's biographer Sanford Horwit, Alinsky took many of Park's classes. 33 Alinsky also spent a full decade doing academically directed participant observation, first with youth gangs and then with the Chicago mob. He published several scholarly articles in the 1930s and early 1940s that reveal his early thinking about power analysis, based on his observations of the power dynamics of both of these non-traditional types of organization. In the late 1930s, bored with criminal justice work, he often referred to boredom as a kind of chief life motivator, and alarmed by the rise of fascism in Europe, Alinsky transitioned from his job in the Joliet prison to moonlighting with the CIO. 34 This gave him his first contact with the people he later said were the best organizers of his day, the Reds. Working as a volunteer, he helped raise funds for striking mine workers and for the international brigades heading off to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Alinsky, unlike the left-wing organizers in the CIO, wanted to defend and protect capitalism. His ideas were very close to Alexis de Tocqueville's. Both Alinsky and Tocqueville were enchanted by the concept of freedom. Both failed to recognize that the wage labor system, the place most individuals spend most hours, is anything but a zone of freedom. Alinsky quotes Tocqueville more often than anyone else in both Réveil for Radicals and Rules for Radicals. He spins Tocqueville's long digressions about the importance of creating a middle class into his own vernacular, calling Tocqueville's middle class the have a little, want some more class. Both he and Tocqueville believed that it's essential to have such a class to ward off the influence of Jacobins and socialists. Stability in our freedom-loving society, Alinsky said, would be achieved by having strong unions, the guarantors of a strong middle class. The unions Alinsky wanted were the kind John L. Lewis believed in. His 1949 book, John L. Lewis, an unauthorized biography, 35 is a 400-page love letter to the man and his work. The book opens with a full-page black and white photo of a regal-looking Lewis standing over Alinsky, his hand gesturing as he explains a concept, while Alinsky takes notes. Both men are wearing crisp suits. The room they inhabit is furnished with handsome lamps and oversized leather chairs. C. Wright Mills's Men of Power would have felt at home in that setting. The photo conveys Alinsky's sense of Lewis as magisterial, and so does his text. To me, Lewis is an extraordinary individual and certainly one of the outstanding figures of our time. 36. In 1941, Alinsky wrote in the American Journal of Sociology, the point of view of the Back of the Yards Council on Organized Labor is quite clear. First, it looks to the national organized labor movements to cope effectively with many of those major social forces which impinge upon the back of the Yards community with disastrous results. 37 He might not have been wrong to imagine, back then, that his job, his added value, was to strategically engage faith-based groups to complement, not substitute for, the power of unions. In the abstract for this article he says, in the industrial area adjacent to the stock yards of Chicago, a community council was formed which included the two basic institutions of the area, 1. Organized religion and 2. Organized labor, as well as all the other interest and action groups. In that community, today, however, Labor's power is almost nil, national unions cannot cope effectively with big issues or, often, small ones, and faith-based community groups can no longer simply attend to local affairs. Without real CIO unions, like those Alinsky knew in Chicago, the Church and Labor Alliance can't possibly match in 2016 what it accomplished in 1939. In fact, Horwood notes that even in the later 1940s and early 1950s, when Alinsky first ventured outside of Chicago to Kansas City and Los Angeles, he couldn't create a community-only model that worked as well as back of the yards. 38 This caused him real concern at the time, because he was fundraising and couldn't show the model working. It wasn't working because a crucial part was missing. He didn't have the very smart, and left-wing, packing house workers organizing committee with him. Conditions and context matter. Alinsky's most serious dogma, one that he fervently preached, was that no one should have dogma. No dogma, and only one ideology, an ideology he repeated in everything he wrote and in every speech he made. He sums it up on page 11 of Rules for Radicals. In the end, this is a conviction, a belief that if people have the power to act, in the long run they will, most of the time, reach the right decisions. Yet that power has resulted in genocide against Native Americans, centuries of slavery, today's mass incarceration of people of color, right-wing opposition to immigrant rights, taxes, and government, and the ongoing denial that unpaid homemaking is as hard as most wage work. None of this easily squares with Alinsky's simple conviction that those who have the power to act will almost always act wisely and well. Seth Borgos, a former Acorn staffer, says, from a historical perspective, that stance about the ends of organizing is astonishing. 39. This is one reason why Gary Delgado, founder of the Center for Third World Organizing, and his successor and protege Rinku Sen have each written solid, constructive, non-sectarian critiques of Saul Alinsky. 40. Delgado locates his in the limitations of the politics of place and race in segregated America. Sen, in her book Stir It Up, argues that Alinsky's obsession with pragmatism and non-divisive issues resulted in decades of well-meant efforts that often undermined the very people who need good organizing the most: the poor, the working class, and people of color, whose issues could hardly be characterized as non-divisive. She points out that Alinskyist groups focused locally and on winnable fights have often reacted to the infusion of drugs into their communities by calling for more police and more prisons. Enter #Black Lives Matter. Similarly problematic, some Alinskyist groups working on education reform today have embraced charter schools, which undermine teachers' unions and siphon public tax dollars out of the publicly controlled school system. 41 In Chicago, the Industrial Areas Foundation (IAF) has yet to stand with the Chicago Teachers Union (CTU) teachers and parents who are struggling to keep schools open in black communities, a situation examined in Chapter 4. A further weakness in the Alinskyist model for community organizing is his discussion of and framework for organizers and leaders, an aspect of his legacy that has deeply penetrated and negatively impacted major union segments, including the Service Employees International Union (SEIU) and the Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union (Unite Here). In Rules for Radicals, Alinsky obscured the issue of organizer strategy. He declared that there are leaders and there are organizers, and that the two are different. The organizer is a behind-the-scenes individual who is not a leader, has nothing to do with decisions or decision-making, and must come from outside the community. They also had to be men. Alinsky didn't believe women were tough enough, even during the era of the feminist movement. The leader, on the other hand, must come from the base constituency and make all the decisions. This is a good narrative, but disingenuous. The organizers in the Alinsky model make many key decisions. A lot of good ink has been devoted to the problems with Alinsky's view of the outside organizer, 42 including in Bardacca's Trampling Out the Vintage. Denying that the organizer is a leader, with substantial influence on the organization, leaves the organizer's actions unchecked and not well understood, as Jerry Brown, the longtime leader of 1199 New England, still one of the most militant and successful local unions in the SEIU, observes. I never heard anyone use Alinsky in any way as a model for us. He was always talked about only in the context of community organizing, and how their organizers always had to be behind the curtain. Their job wasn't to speak publicly, their job was to find and recruit. The union that came closest to this was here, the Hotel Employees and Restaurant Employees Union, because they always had rank-and-file officers who appeared to be the leaders. The rank-and-file officers were often wonderful union members who put a lot of work into the union, but they were very seldom the real, strategic leaders. I thought the 1199 model, with all its troubles with staff being members and sharing leadership, not just facilitating recruitment, it was 100% more honest to what was going on, and actually who was really leading. I just always felt that the way in which here actually led, and the way in which it appeared they led, were very different realities. 43. Chapter 3 describes 1199 NA, which Jerry Brown founded and led from the early 1970s to 2005. The union is well known for routinizing all-out strikes every few years, for setting and maintaining the nation's highest wage, benefit, and workplace standards in nursing home contracts, and for being the most powerful player in Connecticut politics. The role of the organizer in the 1199 NA model is transparent, not hidden, and the role of the members is primary, not secondary. Only the rank and file can strike against the employers. Majority strikes are one strong indicator that workers themselves are determining their fate, rather than leaving it to a professional staff. The biggest flaw in Alinsky's organizer-leader theory, one that critiques of the theory have failed to address, is that it never asks the question that grounds the CIO method. Who is a leader? How do you identify the organic leaders in the base? In Rules for Radicals, the Alinsky text that most self-identified radicals have read, Alinsky doesn't even discuss the concept of leader identification. He does discuss it in the less often read Reveille for Radicals, which he wrote in 1946, before McCarthyism and other factors wrecked the CIO. In Reveille, Alinsky devotes an entire chapter to leader identification, native leadership. He offers no methodology. Alinsky explained most of his theories with stories. Not surprisingly, his only stories in Native Leadership are about unions, like this one. Any labor organizer knows of the Little Joes. When a man is being solicited to join a union, he will usually respond along these lines. Everything you say sounds pretty good, mister, but before I sign up, I want to know if Joe has signed up. 44 inches Joe is the organic leader, the person on the shop floor who has followers. Joe is Sally, found through organic leader identification and structure tests, the mechanisms used to help map the power of individual workers and their networks and relationships. There is a direct and profound relationship between leadership identification theory and building powerful mass-scale movements. The distinction and relationship between leadership identification and leadership development is crucial, and strategists and organizers will have to understand this before ordinary people, the rank and file, can regain the kind of power they need to tackle inequality. The omission of this central discussion from Rules for Radicals did serious damage to the development of the community organizing field during the very period when the largest source of money available to practitioners was founded in the name of supporting Alinsky-style efforts. To say that individual workers and people have relative degrees of power should not in any way be construed as saying all people aren't equally important and deserving as human beings. Of course they are. But in community organizing and some social movement groups, the obsession with leadership development and not leader identification prevents all members of a movement from gaining the collective power they need and deserve. Leadership development without previous leadership identification is a bicycle without wheels. It severely limits how far that movement can go, the success it can and should achieve. Self-identified radicals, those for whom Rules for Radicals has been a de facto organizing manual, exist in and outside of the field of community organizing. Social movement organizations, SMOs, are typically the self-selecting type that Hahn's book describes. They, along with most community-based organizations and now, unfortunately, unions as well, label as a leader just about anyone who enthusiastically shows up at 2 successive meetings, even one, sometimes making the words activist and leader interchangeable. It's an egalitarian impulse, as is the aversion to power. The Occupy movement has muddied this discussion even more with its talk of leaderless movements and horizontalism. But in any strategy for building power, all people are not the same. Given the $50 million, $330 million today, that the CCHD began granting in the early 1970s to the organizations and groups that carried on Alinsky's work. It's not surprising that Alinsky-based thinking has dominated the field coming out of the New Left period. In the 1970s, some of those funds were channeled into what Mary Ann Clausen 45 calls the redistributionist movements, groups like Acorn and Citizen Action and other local community organizing groups. She suggests that these redistributionist groups embraced Alinsky's false organizer-leader definition as a way to deflect criticism from those identity-based groups that noted that mostly white, middle-class men, coming out of the New Left, were still leading groups made up largely of poor women of color. The full-time staff of most of these groups said, "Leaders make the decisions, we just implement them," a claim still made today by SEIU, Unite Here, and many other unions. Clausen points out that CU and Unite Here made a conscious decision to hire from outside their ranks starting in this same era, the 1970s, which was atypical. Randy Shaw's 2008 Beyond the Fields offers a comprehensive examination of the strong ties between the United Farm Workers and the leadership of New Labor, in particular these two unions. Many of the CCHD-funded groups serve as what Howard Kameldorf called the social base for New Labor's organizer recruitment. 46. Aside from the articles and books documenting the links between many of these groups and SEIU and Unite Here, I found evidence for this in my own earlier fieldwork. For example, the United Auto Workers (UAW) maintains a strict policy even today of hiring only from their rank and file. Yet a number of today's key organizers in the New Labor era UAW came directly from the CCHD groups. Phil Wheeler, the former leader of Region 9A of the UAW, which spans the northeastern United States, a union I worked closely with as part of the Stamford Organizing Project, made unionizing the professional field staff of most of the community organizing groups in his region a top priority. When I asked why, the union responded, "So we can hire their organizers as our organizers because they will be considered rank and file." Several of these former community organizers are now in top positions in the national union, having been elevated during the New Labor era. 47. After 1995, following New Labor's ascent to positions of power in the national AFL-CIO, justified by the Alinsky assertion, organizers take orders, leaders lead, professional staffing ballooned, with many new positions added, researchers, political campaigners, and communicators. People in these positions have at least as much real power as the organizers, if not more, further diminishing the importance and voice of the real leaders. New Labor doubles down on mobilizing, corporate campaigns, and collaboration, replace workers. Saul Alinsky is frequently credited with helping to develop the concept of what is now called the corporate campaign. We will never know whether he would have accepted such a designation or not. The uncredited authors of a 1993 paper discussing corporate campaigns, published in the Labor Research Review, note. In fact, for those of us in the 40-something bracket, the classic strategic labor campaign of our formative years was the United Farm Workers' Grape Boycott of the 1960s. It came from Saul Alinsky and his Chicago brand of community organizing. 48. Ray Rogers, in an interview he posted on his website, Corporate Campaign Inc., proclaims the J.P. Stevens fight from 1976 to 1980 the birth of corporate campaigns, and he, too, references Alinsky. 49 Julius Getman's book Restoring the Power of Unions quotes Rogers as saying, "No question. Saul Alinsky played a role in my thinking and SDS 50 in conversation." Marshall Gans, 51, who was deeply involved in the UFW and other boycotts, resoundingly rejected the idea that Alinsky was the inspiration for the Grape Boycott, giving credit instead to the Montgomery bus boycott. But there are many references in recent literature, including a full chapter in Bardacca's Trampling Out the Vintage, 52, to the link between Alinsky and the UFW. Add to this the fact that in 1947, Saul Alinsky hired an organizer named Fred Ross to build a new organization in California, the Community Service Organization, CSO. It was Ross who hired Cesar Chavez to be an organizer with the CSO. In the early 1960s, Chavez decided to start the UFW, and in a twist, he hired Ross as its organizing director. Ross was an active organizer before he met Alinsky, and he developed some traditions that were different from Alinsky's, most notably the house meeting strategy. But Ross, Chavez, and Alinsky were well within what Doug McAdams calls ideologically coherent families. 53 There's no reason to doubt Ganz's account, but there's also no reason to deny that Alinsky's name is frequently linked to the UFW's grape boycott and to corporate campaigns. And the corporate campaign model directs and trains unions to see the employer from the employer's point of view rather than the workers. This is why workers, who were once central to labor actions, are now peripheral. The corporate campaign, emulating Alinsky's tactical warfare, led by a small army of college-educated staff, has taken hold as the dominant weapon against corporations. Peter Olney, longtime national organizing director of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, ILWU, expresses how disproportionate the leverage concept has become. Just before the split at the AFL-CIO, the conversations that New Labour was driving were about how workers really got in the way of organizing. We, the national organizing directors, would actually sit in rooms, in annual meetings about the state of organizing, and the discussion would be that workers often got in the way of union growth deals. 54. It would be difficult to find a clearer statement of how workers are viewed by key staff and leaders in the New Labour model. There are many flow charts and organograms in circulation that outline the corporate campaign's focus on the employer, including on the website of Corporate Campaign Inc. Figure 2.2, below, is a fair representation. In this graphic, 55 the workers are flat, that is, shown as one actor in relationship to a dozen others. They are a single piece of the available leverage points, used to get the employer to agree to union demands. This power analysis, widely accepted by New Labour, rationalizes the shift in focus away from workers as the primary source of leverage against employers to all other actors as equally important sources of leverage. In New Labour's imagination, since workers represent only one of a dozen possible leverage points, it makes sense to rely equally upon the other 11. Unfortunately, the workers' interests also get only a 12th part consideration in whatever deal is made, and rarely, if ever, are the workers present at negotiations with employers or consulted about terms before the deal is concluded. Further, because there are so many other leverage points besides the workers, the proportion of union staff devoted to workers has been reduced, while the proportion that drives toward securing victory in card check and neutrality campaigns and election procedure accords has been dramatically increased. 56 Nelson Lichtenstein noted this in the spring 2010 issue of Dissent, in an article titled, Why American Unions Need Intellectuals. Figure 2.2 Typical Corporate Campaign Research Schematic. This chart produced by Andy Banks and Teresa Conroe, 2002. This new relationship between unions and intellectuals became apparent to me, as well as to columnist and dissentnik Harold Meyerson, when we were invited to address the HERE research staff during separate weekend retreats in coastal California. I expected to talk to just a handful of number crunchers. During its heyday, when the UAW represented 1.5 million workers, the research staff consisted of Nat Weinberg and 3 or 4 of his friends, old socialist comrades of the Ruther brothers. So I was surprised when more than 70 young and energetic researchers awaited my talk, brought together by a union with fewer than 200,000 members. There was even a former student of mine whose experience in Virginia's living wage campaign had turned her on to the labor movement. What could they possibly do to occupy their time and justify the expense of keeping all this ex-collegiate talent on the payroll? Unfortunately, they had plenty of work. HERE's decision to create a cadre of corporate campaigners was based on the grimmest of circumstances. The union used all those researchers to dream up new and creative ways to pressure hotels and casinos, first to get to a card check certification and then to bargain for a satisfactory contract. In this type of power analysis, now the dominant one, workers play the role of what is often called the authentic messenger. Some workers are needed enough to be presented to the media and perhaps testify before legislative bodies, to dismiss or inoculate against an employer's claim that the fight is not about the workers but rather about the union bosses. Workers are seen as a largely undifferentiated mass, and the chief criteria for engaging them is whether or not they initially favor a union. From among workers who do, staff select the most telegenic and likely to appeal to an elite audience such as the media, and use them as the public face of the campaign. They will then be called leaders. Professional communicators write press and legislative statements for them and prepare them to present these well in public. In this model, Union staff need not engage more than a minority of the workforce in the fight, since victory is pursued through one or more of the corporate campaign's other 11 points of leverage. This sidelining of the majority of a workforce, engaging only those already predisposed to support the union activists, would be impossible in a carbon monohypoiodite-style campaign, because the CIO approach is contingent on winning a majority of the workers in a workplace to the cause of the union class struggle. Majorities are also practically necessary, because carbon monohypoiodite model unions run not symbolic but real strikes, in which a supermajority of workers participate. 0.57 And as in the case of 1199 NE, the union expands its base by running and winning NLRB elections, a strategy that also requires a majority. In the CIO approach to organizing a non-union facility, beginning with the opening conversations among and with a newly formed organizing committee of identified organic leaders, one of the key subjects is the importance of being ready to strike to win the first contract. The conversation about strikes is directly linked to the ability of the workers to win for themselves the kinds of contract standards that are life-changing, such as control of their hours and schedules, the right to a quick response to workplace health and safety issues, the right to increased staffing and decreased workload, and the right to meaningful paid sick leave and vacation time. Compared with these gains, a pay raise, too often the chief goal of the new labor model, is a limited win. Table 2.12 Models, Mobilizing versus Organizing. New labor, mobilizing, for, equals low participation. Choice point. CIO, organizing, by, equals high participation. Material conditions only. Pragmatic, business unionism. Purpose of the union. Material and non-material conditions. Belief system anchored in class struggle. No, few strikes, mostly, symbolic, ones. No real strike fund. Primary, leverage, production disrupting, majority strikes. Members build and maintain a strike fund. Power only calibrated to win growth deals. Lower concession costs. Goal, power. Analysis. Power is calibrated to raise quality of life standards at work and at home. High concession costs. Pro-union activists central. Training of authentic messengers. Workers, flat. Get out the vote. GOTV operation is staff-driven. Minority of workers engaged. Worker, focus. Organic worker leaders central. Development of organic leaders into organizers. Majority of workers engaged. Union staff. Consultants, including pollsters, political operatives, and legal and communications firms. Primary, actors, workers, organizers in a complementary role. Workers, the community, but disconnected from workers and reached via union staff or subcontracted to other groups. Secondary, actors. Workers' own community, including faith leaders and community organizations, activated and engaged via the workers in struggle. Researchers, lawyers, communicators. Corporate campaigns, driving a mostly national focus. Amoral tactics. Anything to get the deal, including serious compromises. Card check. Election Procedure Agreements (EPAs). Bargain to Organize (BTO). Types of campaign. NLRB elections, market-based, driving a mostly local and regional focus. Principled tactics. Ethical limits on tactics used to get a deal and, afterward, in the deal, if card check. Card check, EPAs, BTO. Unimportant. Strict limits on bargaining often tied to agreement, few or no workers present. Negotiators mostly lawyers or union representatives. Collective bargaining, crucial. Achieved through open, transparent bargaining, many workers present and involved. Negotiators mostly organizers. Narrow, material issues on the table. Contract standards unimportant. Contracts used as a tool for teaching self-governance, all issues on the table. Contract standards crucial. Narrow, limited to contract terms. Contract enforcement follows grievance and arbitration procedures, if allowed by a court. Some prevent this. Representation. Model. Broad shop floor issue reach. Direct action by workers. Grievance and arbitration followed if direct action fails. In the cases discussed in this book, a set of common traits can be observed that correlate to the two distinct approaches, organizing and mobilizing. The campaigns that win workers the highest impact success follow the classic carbon monohypoiodite era organizing model. The campaigns that gained lesser victories were fought using new labor's mobilizing approach. Three core factors distinguish the two models: the purpose of the union, the power analysis defining the fight, and the union's governance method. The first, the purpose of the union, is the most important and frames the other two. Each of the three factors involves a set of strategic choices made by individual actors that determines which model they will adhere to. Table 2.1 above lays out and explains this process. Very different purposes for forming a union produce very different approaches to power analysis and governance. If individual actors believe that the purpose of the union is to enable a majority of workers to engage in mass collective struggle, for the betterment of themselves, their families, and their class, then in the related choice point, the role of the workers in the union drive, workers will not be mere symbols of the struggle, they will be central actors in it. If, however, the purpose of the union is only to improve the material condition of workers by increasing the share of company profits they receive, the workers' role will be greatly diminished. They will function as symbolic actors, not central participants, much as they do in today's fast food, wage campaigns. The conversation about gaining the strength needed to strike continues with governance, the third of the overall core factors that determine whether the approach is a low participation mobilizing or high participation organizing approach. In a union like 1199 NE, governance methods are the same as unionization methods. High participation remains a constant goal. Bob Muhlenkamp, the organizing director of the old National 1199, explained this in a brief but brilliant speech, also published as an essay. The theme here is organizing never stops. We can't afford to stop. That is why we must in our internal organizing work be as serious and as intense as we are during an NLRB organizing drive about building the union to fight the bosses. 58. In 1199 NE shops, the contract is not enforced primarily through the power of lawyers and arbitration, but on the shop floor, in direct actions led by organic worker leaders, who ideally graduate from the organizing committee to the bargaining team to a delegate's or steward's post. And to cement the idea of 3 sides to 2, that is, that the union really is the workers and not a third party, a foundational principle of the union is that all workers are invited and encouraged to attend contract negotiations with employers. The collective bargaining table is the only place under U.S. law where workers sit as legal equals to their employer. As such, it's seen as crucial to the approach, as Bernie Minder notes in the unpublished manual he wrote for 1199. How to conduct negotiations becomes very important. If the real negotiations are going on behind the scenes, and the committee participation is a front, it will only further encourage 3 sides rather than 2. Protecting the members from having to cope and deal with the problems the boss creates helps nobody. A maximum mobilization of the membership is our only real source of strength. To get this requires genuine participation. This in no way hampers the flexibility often needed for negotiations. It's also a good test of whether or not a union is democratic. If the union is truly an organization of the workers, why wouldn't any worker be invited to at least observe his or her own contract negotiations? 3 questions can determine whether or not the union is a third party in the renegotiation of a collective bargaining agreement. Does the process involve every worker? Are negotiations fully transparent? Can any worker attend? In the new labor mobilizing model, most collective bargaining is handled in top-down, staff-only negotiations with employers. If workers are present, there will typically be very few, say between 5 and 10, no matter how many thousands of workers are involved. Those chosen few are not expected, or even allowed, to speak during the negotiations. This process creates and solidifies the idea that the union is, in fact, a third party. In addition, most unions begin negotiations by signing a document with the employer that in fact they are not legally required to sign, known as the ground rules. These typically include a gag rule, stipulating that the already closed, already too small group of workers who sit, often with a hired lawyer, as representatives of the whole union are prohibited from discussing the details of the negotiations with any other workers throughout the entire negotiation process. In negotiations for neutrality deals, whether those are for card check or election procedure agreements, it has become routine for union staff alone to pre-negotiate certain conditions, including how bargaining will take place and sometimes even including actual contract terms. Alinsky was not known for his governance skills. He famously joked in the Playboy interview and in documentaries that none of his organizations were any good a few years after the initial campaign victory. New Labor has carried on this Alinskyist tradition too. By contrast, as Chapter 3 illustrates, 1199 unions, even in negotiations with employers to win neutrality deals, bargain across the table, with no ground rules, and all workers are welcome to take part. Worker agency is a prerequisite for organizing and for building powerful structures. Whole worker organizing. Restoring the CIO approach for a new economy. The working class does need more power to win. That is irrefutable. William Foster devotes an entire chapter of organizing methods in the steel industry to what he calls special organizational work. The chapter is divided into 4 sections. Unemployed, WPA. Fraternal organizations, churches, and other organizations. Under churches, Foster says, in many instances, strongly favorable sentiment to the organization campaign will be found among the churches in the steel towns. This should be carefully systematized and utilized. Under fraternal organizations, there should be committees set up in the local organizations of these fraternal bodies in order to systematically recruit their steel worker members into the AA, Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers. 59. The CIO organizing methods incorporated an appreciation of power inside and outside the workplace. They used a systematic approach to recruiting support not only from the shop floor but also from the broader community in which the workers lived. Yet today, most good unions that organize inside the shop mobilize outside it, deep inside, shallow outside. It's as if they can't see the full extent of the battlefield or the vastness of their army. A one-dimensional view of workers as workers rather than as whole people limits good organizing and constrains good worker organizers from more effectively building real power in and among the workers' communities. Since the early 1970s, the period of focus for Skocpol's diminished democracy, a period dominated by Alinsky's teachings, community power, like workplace power, has decreased. Most groups in the broader community now have little to no power. Yet even unions that organize effectively at the local level have usually contracted their community support work out to these relatively weak groups, mobilizing rather than organizing. When the groups then fail to bring serious power to back the workers in a tough private sector fight, the organizers who enlisted them conclude, incorrectly, the community stuff doesn't work. They miss that the problem with the community stuff is their own reliance on the weak approach of advocacy or mobilizing, an approach they would never use for the fight inside the workplace. For the inside fight, these unions have a theory of power. They understand how to identify the most influential workers among the total workforce. They pay attention to semantics, and they create structure tests to assess precisely how much power they're building step by step. Sadly, they check all this intelligence at the door when they step outside the shop and shift their horizon line to the community, for which they have no concomitant theory of power, no concomitant theory of leader identification. If they see the community's potential contribution as weak, it is because they don't apply the same standards to recruiting and building it, with the workers themselves doing their own community outreach among their own pre-existing social networks. The very unions that practice two sides as two sides inside the workplace practice three sides out in the community. To restore worker power to 1930s levels requires an organizing model inside and outside the shop, based on CIO practice in the 1930s and 1940s but adapted to today's conditions. CIO model union organizers today frequently take the shortcut of engaging an already pro-union or progressive priest or minister, the equivalent of the staunchly pro-union worker activists inside the shop, who can win, to stand with them at a press conference, a practice they know wouldn't be effective in the workplace. And just as the most enthusiastic worker activists are often not capable of leading their co-workers, so, too, the most committed activist religious leaders often can't lead their colleagues. To build power in the community, the good organizer must apply the same intelligence, skills, and techniques, beginning with painstakingly identifying organic community leaders, as he or she does to building power and organic leadership in the workplace. True organizing in the workplace plus true organizing in the community can and does win. Organizing in the workplace plus mobilizing in the community does not. To clarify the degree of power required, this book builds on a thesis developed by Joseph Luders in the civil rights movement and the logic of social change. 60 Luders' theory about cost structures related to protest outcomes is situated in the civil rights literature, not the labor literature, but interestingly, in order to construct his analysis about success in the civil rights movement he relies in part on union literature and the economic outcomes from strikes. This point, so salient, he makes not in his text but in his footnotes. The quote that opens this book is the 162nd footnote in Luders. Curiously, the labor movement is conventionally ignored by scholars of social movements. Those words follow these. I suggest that economic actors differ in their exposure to the disruption costs that movements generate in launching protest marches, sit-ins, boycotts, picketing, and so on. Some of these insights have been investigated by labor historians and economists seeking to explicate strike outcomes. 61. Luders argues that the most successful organizing drives in the civil rights movement, a movement fighting for voting rights and individual civil liberties, were those that carried high economic concession costs for the racist regime, that is, those by which movement actors could inflict a high degree of economic pain. Luders created what he calls an economic opportunity structure to explain and predict outcomes of the power of people, that is, of agency. He argues that even though the movement's goals were civil and political rights, it took economic actors to move the entrenched political racists to shift their positions. His thesis is threefold. First, economic duress is a major proximate cause behind the decision of economic actors to make substantial concessions to movement demands. Second, two general movement-imposed costs can be distinguished, and the uneven vulnerability among economic actors to these costs produces distinctive responses. And, third, economic sectors vary in their exposure to the costs movements generate. The two movement-imposed costs are what he calls the concession cost, that is, how much it will cost a business to agree to the movement's demands, measured against the disruption cost, or the ability of the movement to create highly effective actions against the target. Luders's concession and disruption costs are central to my overall analysis about power. I build on Luders's thesis, situated in the social movement theory literature, by unpacking it and showing that it can function as a tool for power analysis in workplace and non-workplace settings. It makes sense that he drew on labor literature to arrive at his framework, because the same framework is routine in successful, high-stakes union negotiations. When I was a labor negotiator, we called Luders's concession costs the cost of settlement. And what he calls disruption costs we called the ability to create a crisis for the employer. 62. The two are always seen in relation to each other. I am using Luders's concession costs as a broader, power required variable in this book's discussion of relative success and relative defeat in the new millennium. Success in any fight or any contestation waged by movement activists across sectors absolutely requires making an accurate assessment of Luders's concession costs before the fight begins. Movement actors can and must reasonably predict the concession costs in advance. Otherwise, they enter the fight without knowing which strategies to deploy. As Luders says, different economic actors are unequally vulnerable and concession costs are not static. They're variable and contingent on the ability of actors to force disruption costs. If, for example, the movement actors' demand is for single-payer healthcare, activists must understand what it will cost the healthcare industrial complex to concede that demand. Without that understanding, they will not know the magnitude of the fight on their hands, and might adopt the wrong strategy, applying an insufficient mobilizing approach rather than an all-out organizing approach. An incorrect power analysis can lead people who want to end capitalism to think that small numbers of demonstrators occupying public spaces like parks and squares and tweeting about it will generate enough power to bring down Wall Street. Others might think that the good frames used for or derived from these occupations will marshal enough emotion to suddenly overwhelm lawmakers with the revelation that the system is unfair, and the lawmakers then will institute a set of fair regulations to govern corporate capital. Or if movement actors were to demand a more equitable funding of the public school system, but never grapple with what that would cost or where the money might come from. They might well apply strategies insufficient to generate the disruptive power needed to force attention to their claim. Building on Luders's thesis about the relationship between disruption and concession costs in the civil rights movement, 63, I extend his logic into my overall argument about what kind of success is possible under the mobilizing approach versus what the organizing approach can achieve. In Table 2.2, concession costs equals power required, I specify a set of conditions that will generate employer concession costs from low to high. The vertical axis is the cost of settlement, meaning, in real dollars, what the employer will have to pay out of the company's overall expense budget and profits to settle a contract with a given group of workers. 64 Importantly, this cost isn't just the absolute value of wages or benefits, it is the cost in relationship to the overall expense of running the business. The horizontal axis is what I call ideological resistance. Drawing on my case analyses as well as my field experiences, I propose that there are two types of business leaders, the pragmatic, or practical, and the diabolically anti-union. There might be a partly pragmatic and partly diabolical resistance to unions where there are high-cost employees involved, but I have found no evidence of this. Chapter 3 and some works in the literature do offer examples of large-scale employers straddling the two positions, but these are the employers with less at stake, dealing with lower-cost employees and facing lower-cost union demands. Such employers can be bought if the union pays or arranges to cover the concession cost, for example by securing higher government subsidies for the company, or lowering taxes for the employer, a typical strategy for new labor-era unions. While ideological resistance is often correlated with, or assumed to be the cost of, doing business, it is not always so. In fact, the key to most high-impact, high-success union strategy for 100 years has been identifying the pragmatic practical employer within the higher-cost workforce's field, because this is how unions with high-cost workers make significant breakthroughs. The entire concept of pattern bargaining is based on a union that follows the organizing model, such as the old United Auto Workers of the 1940s or today's 1199 New England. The workers must have the ability to strike, and they must have already lined up the market, meaning strategically timed all their contracts in a given geography and/or industry to expire simultaneously. When these conditions are met, the union starts the bargaining process with the practical pragmatic employer to set the pattern high, assuring this employer that they have the power to win the same settlements with the next employer in the industry with whom they will sit across the table days later. Even in this scenario, striking, or the credible threat of a real strike based on recent real strikes, is required to move employers at the high cost of settlement level. Case studies in Chapter 3 demonstrate that the reason 1199 is able to win strong contracts, including defined benefit pension plans enabling health service workers to retire when caring for patients has taken a physical toll, and even contracts winning neutrality deals for non-union workers of the same employer, but without negative consequences for unorganized nursing home workers, is precisely because they run majority strikes often enough that the employers know their strike threat is real and credible. Ideological resistance can also be relevant to the issue of shop floor rights versus material gains in contract settlements, since these carry different concession costs. Kimmeldorf discusses the role this difference played in the strategies and outcomes of the West Coast and East Coast dock workers. The West Coast workers, who wanted control of production, had to strike to win. On the East Coast, because the union was only demanding more money, the boss was willing to settle without a strike. Some employers in the higher cost of settlement category might agree to increased wages and substantial benefits after a strike, but hold out on workers' rights over production decisions for ideological reasons, that is, belief in employer control of the shop floor. Table 2.2 Power required, concession costs. In my own negotiations with hospital employers, there is evidence that the boss will even surrender on production issues when two conditions are present. The union can mount an effective strike, and the employer comes to understand that the workers might actually make better decisions than line managers, decisions that would positively impact the employer's bottom line. The Affordable Care Act offers a present-day example of this dynamic. New Medicaid and Medicare reimbursement rules tie higher reimbursement rates to better patient outcomes. Bedside nurses almost always have better ideas than management regarding what will heal the patient better and faster, so a pragmatic employer might even grant production decision-making to a high-power generating hospital workers union. On the other hand, janitors, for example, are low-wage workers and represent a tiny fraction of the overhead of the corporations whose buildings they clean. If the demand on the part of the union is also low, a mobilizing model with only a minority of workers and a handful of not very powerful community allies can win. This is a typical Justice for Janitors campaign model, and too few people understand that it can't simply be exported to other sectors, especially not to higher wage sectors where wage and benefit costs alone are literally 60 to 70% of the employer's overall expenses, for example teachers with public pensions or nursing home workers with classic defined benefit pensions. In the mobilizing approach used in the far lower cost Justice for Janitors model, essentially all the employer needs is the union's guarantee that it will negotiate a trigger agreement, meaning that the small wage increase for the workers, 50 cents or $1 per hour, won't take effect until the union succeeds at getting all cleaning contractors in the area to agree to the same terms. Such a settlement is very inexpensive to the corporation, taken as a ratio of cost to overall expenses, concession costs. It's considerably easier to shift even a conservative, anti-union corporate owner to the practical business decision to settle these low-cost workers' demands. I argue that little real power is built by this version of mobilizing. Although the union expands its membership and some janitors get a raise, it is not a life-altering change, and the process develops few real worker leaders, or none. Equally significant, such a fight rarely develops new organic community leaders. Those involved are generally already involved, already pro-union priests and pro-union self-selecting activist types. They have not been recruited or trained systematically, and, so, this approach is not an organizing approach in the community, it is a mobilizing approach in and outside the workplace and isn't expanding the worker army. With the exception of the Chicago Teachers Union, today even most organizing unions rarely systematize their brilliant approach with workers on the inside by using an equally brilliant approach to the workers' own organic community on the outside. The CTU learned from the British Columbia Federation of Teachers that to win a massive and illegal strike, it had to have staunch support, active support, tested and well prepared from parents, students, and key community institutions. The Chicago teachers voted in a new leadership in 2010 that already met the first criteria for the organizing model. They believe the purpose of the union is to enable workers to radically change their lives in all aspects, that the union is a tool for class struggle. They knew that this condition could only be met if ordinary workers, not staff, were the primary agents of change. The teachers had built strong ties to key community and neighborhood-based groups throughout Chicago. The leadership saw the relationship with parents, students, and the broader community as something more than an alliance. If they called a strike, parents would be key, either with decisive support, or potentially decisive hostility, in which case they'd be advancing the agenda of the mayor, not that of the teachers. They were right, and they had just enough of a direct rapport with parents directly through their students and indirectly through their many community allies to beat Mayor Rahm Emanuel and save their union by rebuilding it through a strike. The most profound success of the Chicago teachers' strike was the building of powerful solidarities among teachers and between teachers and the whole of Chicago's working class. That their leader, Karen Lewis, an African-American high school teacher, would go on to poll consistently as the most popular person in the city to challenge the incumbent in the mayoral race would have been utterly unimaginable before the strike. I propose a schematic different from the typical corporate campaign example shown in Figure 2.2. Instead of making workers a 1/12th peripheral consideration, as do some union strategists, in Figure 2.3 I put them at the very center of every campaign to challenge corporate power. If New Labor devoted the time and energy to understanding and engaging each and every relationship that workers organically possess in their community, rather than focusing on the boardroom of the employer, the kind and level of power of built would yield far greater success. Table 2.3 Power Available, Disruption Costs. To blunt the employer's edge, rank-and-file workers need these strong ties. With them, they will be able to do the organizing and unionizing work themselves that today is mostly being done by paid staff, and do it far more effectively. When this model was followed in Chicago, the results were stunning. Jake Rosenfeld, in his book What Unions No Longer Do, 65 published in 2014, argues that there are only two forces in U.S. society that have an equal and high rate of influence on how ordinary people vote: unions and religious institutions. He describes how well the right has applied this, making an intentional power move to build an evangelical base of voters, a base that grew steadily while leftists in good CIO-style organizing unions said, "I don't like religion, I do class, that's why I am not building relationships with them." That's an actual quote from this author's interview with an extremely successful organizer. Yet this is in direct contradiction to the belief system of good organizers, the kind that believe in worker agency. If a community or other tie matters to the workers, that should be enough for good union organizers. If faith matters to workers, I argue it has to matter to unions. Otherwise, the union remains a third party in the church, not of the membership, but apart from it. Reverend Nelson Johnson, a key player in a workers' victory discussed in Chapter 5, said that when union members who are also congregation members talk to faith leaders, and these engagements are personal conversations about the congregation member, labor wins many new and often powerful religious leader converts to the cause of unions. This work is much more important than devoting time to tactical maneuvers with 1% shareholders or businesses in the supply chain of a corporate target. People in carbon monohypoiodide-style labor unions who say they don't do religion should at least view working with religious leaders through their members as a viable defense tactic. As Rosenfeld points out, it is through religion that the right wing continues to expand into the labor base. As a result, this base has been voting against its own interests for Scott Walker and for Rick Snyder. And for many other ultra-conservative governors and state legislators, who cynically promise to cut taxes while gutting public pensions to give the little people, the hard-working taxpayers in our state, a raise. The many statistics linking religion and voting are the most important numbers in Rosenfeld's book, because they don't tell us about the past, they tell us about the future. They hint loudly at the strategy described here. The effectiveness of that strategy is made very evident in the case studies described in this book. For the entire climate to change nationally as it changed in Chicago, good unions need to engage the broader community in the fight, so that the community, of which the workers are an organic part, transforms along with the workplace. That is an organizing model with a bottom-up strategy, capable of movement building rather than mere moment actualization. The large numbers of women in today's workforce, saddled with wage work and endless non-wage work, don't separate their lives in the way industrial era, mostly male workers could, entering one life when they arrived at work and punched in, and another when they punched out. The pressing concerns that bear down on most workers today are not divided into two neat piles, only one of which need be of concern to the union, while the other is divided up among a dozen single-issue interest groups, none of which has the union's collective strength. To effectively challenge neoliberal capitalism in the present moment, to successfully challenge the excessive corporate power that defines our era, unions must create a whole worker organizing model that helps, rather than hinders, large numbers of Americans to see the connections between corporate domination of their work lives, their home lives, and their country's political structures. Figure 2.4 offers an illustration of how Chicago's teachers behaved after 2010, of how the workers at Smithfield won the third round of their fight, and what Connecticut looks like when the whole union brings the whole community into the fight. Figure 2.3 Whole Worker Charting, Social Networks. Figure 2.4 Whole Worker Comprehensive Organizing. 3. Nursing Home Unions, Class Snuggle vs. Class Struggle. The strike muscle is like any other muscle, you have to keep it in good shape or it will atrophy. Jerry Brown, former president, Local Union District 1199 New England 1. If workers are ready to go on strike in the United States, and we are ready to pay them to strike, it would be very costly. But paying workers in Indonesia or India or other places to go on strike against the same global employer isn't particularly expensive. Andy Stern, former national president, SEIU 2. This chapter will analyze two radically different approaches to forming and governing unions in private sector nursing homes. To reflect how diverse big national unions can be, I have chosen two local unions that are part of the same national union, the Service Employees International Union, SEIU. One model, represented by SEIU Local 775, exemplifies the strategies adopted by the national SEIU under Andrew Stern, president from 1996 through 2009. I argue that those strategies significantly diminish the role of workers in their own emancipation and have contributed to labor's ongoing decline. The second model exemplifies the origins and traditions of another local, SEIU 1199 New England, 1199 NE, a union still steeped in the carbon monohypoiodide era influence of its founders, that has achieved the highest nursing home standards in the nation. For the purposes of this chapter, I have turned to that particular local union and not to any other inside or outside SEIU, even those with 1199 in their official name. I argue that 1199 New England's organizing model is similar today to what it was in 1968, when the new York-based National 1199 Union began expanding into new regions across the U.S. The National Union no longer exists, sadly, as it merged mostly into SEIU in two waves, 1989 and 1998. The workers in these two cases are similarly situated in the private sector, considered low-skilled and easy to replace, and are employed by some of the same national corporate owners in two blue states, Washington and Connecticut. I agree with Barbara Ehrenreich that the term low-skilled is offensive and wrong. How could work with the sick and or elderly be low-skilled? In Washington, the union's strategy was to create a partnership with the employer that resulted in the unionizing of 23 nursing homes. 3. A small increase in pay, a constrained and limited set of worker protections, an absolute and permanent prohibition on the right to strike, and virtually no difference in benefits for union versus non-union workers. In Connecticut, in a comparable period, the union conducted nearly 60 successful union elections, using militant trade union methods, including strikes, and achieved strong contracts that substantially increased pay and benefits and greatly expanded on-the-job protections, resulting in the highest standards in the United States among nursing home workers. Each local union includes thousands of workers of other types, primarily from the public sector, and in the public sector both have achieved real material gains. But organizing and bargaining in the public sector is considerably easier than it is the private sector. And in the two states under discussion, public sector unionization is a cruise ship vacation compared with the war zone battleship tour of unionization in the private sector. Academics and movement strategists don't need books about how to win the easy fights, but rather books about how to win the difficult ones. The different approach of each effort I describe was a far greater factor than any differences between the two states, and this accounts for the difference in outcomes. Because each local union in this chapter produces victories, in this chapter I focus on those outcomes that highlight the relative nature of victory and raise the question, what is built or developed from the two unions' successes? The evidence suggests that the strengths of the 1199 NE model are capable of developing powerful member-led unions, the kind that can rebuild the labor movement in a hostile climate. The national union model, represented by the Washington State Local, has succeeded better in the public sector than in the private because its model doesn't require class struggle, but rather an advocacy approach using behind-the-scenes political and financial transactions and deal-making. A union is never built by a single person. However, each of the local unions discussed in this chapter is associated with a union leader who is indelibly linked to the organization. And these two local union leaders personify two very different traditions in the labor movement past and present. Though his outward appearance is quite different, David Rolfe, the president of Local 775, is in all other respects a clone of Andrew Stern, who ran SEIU as its president from 1996 to 2010. The speeches each make and quotes they gave in many published interviews would fool the best new labor enthusiast in a blind test. Similarly, the founder and longtime president of District 1199 New England, 1199NE, Jerry Brown, was long considered a close adherent of Leon Davis, former national president and founder of 1199, when it was still a freestanding, national union. To understand the two locals today, it is important to understand more about Andy Stern and Leon Davis and the distinct traditions they represent, which still operate in Local 775 and 1199NE. Local 775, Origins and Approach to Private Sector Nursing Homes. Andy Stern was the face of New Labor. He generated an endless stream of high-profile newspaper headlines, including a lengthy New York Times feature, The New Boss, a profile in Fortune, The New Face of Labor, He's Like No Union Boss You've Ever Seen, a Business Week feature, Can This Man Save Labor? And the Wall Street Journal's, Say Stern. Top's White House visitor list. Stern's rise to the leadership of the national SEIU began in 1972. In that year, he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, where he initially studied business before switching majors, and got a job in the career he later chose, social work. As Stern recounts in a long interview, which he gave less than a year after his 2009 resignation, it all began this way. I had spent time trying to figure out how to change American foreign policy, or at least try to end the war in Vietnam. I had done some work with welfare rights and other community organizations, and worker-client kind of relationships. So it was following more of a social activist trend. I don't come from a union family. Unions were not discussed positively or negatively in my household. When people would take over college administration buildings, I would supply the food. I was a much more practical, less ideological person. Point 4. Stern suggested in this interview that the joke with which he opened many of his stump speeches over the years, that he went to a union meeting to get free pizza and wound up a steward, was slightly fictionalized version of the truth, played for a laugh. In fact, he said, I was looking for a purpose, not pizza. 5. He would rise from steward in his union in Pennsylvania to local union president in 1977, and in 1983 to organizing director of the National Union. For the next 13 years, he functioned as a top confidant and lieutenant to then CU President John Sweeney. And when Sweeney ran for president of the National AFL-CIO, leading the new Voices leadership ticket in 1995, Stern outmaneuvered the opposition to become president of SEIU. By defeating Sweeney's heir apparent, Stern demonstrated he was capable of overcoming the tradition of most unions, in which one president steps down and neatly hands the keys to his heir. Stern showed his ability to effectively manage convention politics, as in quadrennial union conventions. He'd had a chance to practice these convention tactics on the ground 4 years earlier, at SEIU's 1992 convention, where he first gained his reputation for running roughshod over the concept of union democracy. At the 1992 convention, Stern was a key national staffer, assigned as such to discipline and defeat a coalition of local union leaders who had arrived at the convention with demands for greater union democracy, including direct elections for national union officers, an end to dual payrolls. The National Executive Board members in SEIU received lavish pay as board members, and were also collecting full paychecks as union leaders in their own unions, and an even more basic demand, that they could bring these and other issues to the convention floor even though the Executive Board had earlier rejected them. Stern's top-down squelching of member debate and decision-making on that occasion would characterize his entire tenure at SEIU. Point 6. Yet when Stern won the national presidency in 1996, most people inside the union were either excited or cautiously optimistic, because Stern was full of energy, was willing to review long-standing customs, and appeared open to real change. He was smart and charismatic, and he was raising all the important issues. We can't keep organizing just any worker who calls. It doesn't get us any power in any industry. How should we focus? We are shrinking faster in labor than we are growing. How can we recruit more members? The labor movement is in big trouble. What can we do to change the future? Many Stern critics can agree he was asking the right questions. But when he began to answer them, problems arose that went back to his 1992 actions, problems that, to borrow Skocpol's words, diminished democracy inside the union. At Stern's second convention as president, in 2000, the biggest push was to get a massive increase in per capita payments approved by the delegates. Per capita payments are the portion of union dues that local unions pay over to their national unions. Stern advanced one of the single biggest increases in per capita funds at that time that any labor leader could remember. The resolution won approval, and Stern essentially replicated the explosive growth in nationally administered resources and national staff that the UAW and others had achieved in the 1950s. From the 2000 convention to 2012, the union's income from per capita payments almost tripled, from $101 million to just under $300 million. Membership did increase in this period, by about 37%, but not enough to account for the huge increase in per capita revenue. Likewise, there were 416 union employees listed in the union's financial reports in 2000, and 863 in 2012. And these staff numbers do not include another significant layer of senior staff Stern brought on as full-time consultants, an addition that would increase the total substantially over 863. These consultants functioned as staff, but their salaries were often so large it was politically impossible to call them so. By calling them consultants, Stern could avoid reporting how many there were and how much they were paid, because consultants are handled differently in federal reporting. The union also began to spend lavishly on consultants who actually remained consultants, working out of their own firms, but in near total service to the union. There were and are hundreds of them. SEIU had never previously been a big player in national politics, but the union's new resources allowed Stern to start lunching with governors and party leaders, and hand over million-dollar checks. With the shift to a massive national union staff and concurrent national budgets, Stern's profile and ambition began to grow. The vast majority of these new funds were not spent on existing union members, but rather on launching a high-level and top-down program to grow the national membership. Servicing existing members, or paying them much attention of any kind, was not on the to-do list. Stern's top chief strategist for growing the membership was Tom Woodruff, one of his executive vice presidents, who also held the title of organizing director. Woodruff found dealing with existing members not only a distraction but also a drag on the strategy he and Stern were pushing with missionary zeal. Working with corporations, so that those corporations would stop opposing unionization. Woodruff summed up a key aspect of this strategy. The organizing model points us in the most narrow way. The better job you do with 15% of the market, the more the boss wants to wipe you out. We have to direct our energy outside. 8. That is, if SEIU insisted on being really good at representing the members when they had only a minority of employers in any particular industry, it would incentivize the employers against unions. The chief problem with their strategy is that most workers form unions precisely to get protections from their bad bosses. Stern and Woodruff weren't going to be sidetracked by this fact. Instead, they focused on devising strategies, like the rest of the new labor-era unions, to cut deals in corporate boardrooms, making actual workers' votes and needs and opinions less important to the growth process itself. The union leadership went from using CIO language about organizing to using Wall Street language about growth metrics. Semantics matter. Two factors link Stern's ascent in CO to the evolution of the mobilizing model. First, he typifies the exact generation Stokpal analyzes in Diminished Democracy, the generation that emerged from college toward the end of the turbulent 1960s and that had been part of the New Left era. Inspired by civil rights achievements, additional rights movements exploded in the 60s and 70s, promoting equality for women, recognition and dignity for homosexuals, the unionization of farm workers, and the mobilization of other non-white ethnic minorities. Movements also arose to oppose U.S. involvement in the war in Vietnam, to champion a new environmentalism, and to further a variety of other public causes. At the forefront of these groundswells were younger Americans, especially from the growing ranks of college students and university graduates. 9. Second, in his post-resignation interview, when Stern declared himself less ideological and more practical, he was using the buzzwords of Saul Alinsky. The experience Stern refers to, his work with welfare rights and community organizations, would have put him in direct contact with Alinsky's ideas, as these were the organizations that Alinsky and the Catholic Campaign for Human Development most deeply penetrated. And Stern at the time had switched from a major in business to the profession. Most influenced by Alinsky, social work. Seth Borgos, long associated with Acorn, progressive philanthropy, where he frequently collaborated with the Catholic Campaign for Human Development and now the Center for Community Change, said in an interview. Alinsky's critique of the discipline, social work, was that it was insensible to power dynamics, dedicated to adjusting people to structural conditions rather than figuring out how to change the conditions. His obsession with power was a defining moment in the separation of community organizing from its social work origins, but the result is that Alinsky often seems far closer to Machiavelli than to a king, Ruther, or Marx. 10. Stern himself was frequently accused of being hostile to the idea of democracy. So was Alinsky, and so is David Rolfe. Rolfe's rise as Stern's protege. David Rolfe was and is a protege of Andrew Stern. He may be the closest adherent to Sternism in the Union today. He and Stern sound indistinguishable when they speak of their shared belief that unions are a 20th century concept, and you hardly ever hear either of them talk about actual workers. Harold Meyerson, writing in the American Prospect in 2014, 11 links Stern and Rolfe throughout his article. Rolfe studied how Silicon Valley incubated startups. With Stern, he paid a call on former Intel CEO Andy Grove, that rare Silicon Valley guru who'd written critically about American businesses' abandonment of American workers. Grove told us he didn't know enough about the subject to offer specific advice, Rolfe says. But he did say to think about outcomes and treat everything else, laws, strategies, structures, as secondary. That made me understand the death of collective bargaining isn't something we should be sentimental about. Later, in the same article, Meyerson reports of Rolfe's critics, Rolfe and Stern's attraction to the culture of Silicon Valley, their belief that labor could profitably learn from the Valley's experience with startups, and their penchant for business school lingo have only further estranged their critics. Profitably may have been the perfect word choice, because both Stern and Rolfe regularly use the term growth in place of the word organizing. Between 1999 and 2000, the National SEIU hatched a plan to create what would become a breakthrough growth strategy, a plan to unionize public sector home care workers into a single union in the state of Washington. But to even attempt developing a statewide local, SEIU had to first create and pass a new state law, because in Washington, as in most of the nation in early 2001, home care workers were treated as independent contractors. If successful, the creation of a statewide home care authority would represent a second major breakthrough for CO in home care worker unionization. The first breakthrough had been made in California, over an 11-year period, 1987 to 1999. In 1992, after a 5-year campaign to do it, the Union passed a statewide law that gave local authorities at the county and municipal levels the right to form legal entities, creating an employer of record, with which thousands of home care employees could then negotiate over the terms and conditions of their work. This changed their employment status from that of independent contractors working for an individual to that of employees working for the local authorities who actually paid their salaries. 12. As a result, between 1994 and 1997, 17,000 home care workers had unionized in Northern California as employees of 3 separate local authorities: Alameda, San Francisco, and Contra Costa counties, in that order. 13. Then, in 1999, SEIU succeeded in the largest single home care victory, the unionization of 74,000 home care workers in Los Angeles County. The person credited with the Los Angeles victory was David Rolfe, though others previous to him actually did a lot of the legwork. The national SEIU decided it was too problematic to make him the top leader of that new Los Angeles local because, according to sources not willing to be officially cited by name, because he was a white man and the new union's workers were mostly African American and Latino women. So it was partly to reward Rolfe that SEIU's national president Andrew Stern suggested Rolfe launch a new home care effort in Washington state, where if he succeeded in forming a new union he could also get to become its head. By November 6, 2001, in Washington, ballots were being counted on Initiative Measure 775, a referendum to create a statewide home care authority. 14. The original plan was that after the ballot initiative passed, home care workers would become members of Local 6, which began as a janitors union and already included non-professional, private sector healthcare workers. Eventually, however, a new local union was created instead. Local 775, taking its name from the ballot initiative number. What transpired between the original plan to put the newly unionized home care workers into Local 6 and the formation of Local 775 is representative of how SEIU created and destroyed local unions during the Stern years. At the time the ballot initiative passed, there was no plan for the creation of yet another local in the state of Washington, which already had 3 SEIU locals: 1199 NW Northwest, which represented registered nurses in hospitals, clinics, and other health care settings; 925, a local of mainly classified staff, so-called non-professionals, at the University of Washington, and later other types of workers; and Local 6, which began as a janitors union and by 2001 also included non-nurse health care staff. When Rolfe moved to Seattle to run the strategy for creating a statewide home care authority, he became a staff member of Washington's SEIU Council, the lobbying arm SEIU establishes in each state that works across the local unions to coordinate politics and legislative affairs. Conveniently, shortly after Rolfe's arrival in Washington, the longtime leader of Local 6, Mark Earls, announced his plan to retire, and Rolfe quickly shifted to become a staff member at Local 6, which already had the appropriate jurisdiction for long-term care workers. Without wasting time, Rolfe announced he was running for president and put together a slate. He invited a Local 6 indigenous leader, Sergio Salinas, to run with him, but in the number 2 spot, the position of secretary-treasurer. Salinas had been a union leader in his country of origin, El Salvador, where he was jailed for his union activism. He'd come to the United States as a refugee. He started working as a janitor in Seattle, became an organizer, and earned broad popular support among the rank-and-file base. Salinas was an organic leader. One peculiarity of the SEIU model is that often the staff of a local union are also members of it, regardless of whether they come from the rank-and-file. Stern and Rolfe's plan, that Rolfe would become president of Local 6 when Mark Earls stepped down, became complicated when Salinas decided to rebel. It turned out that while Salinas had said yes to running with Rolfe as his number 2, Salinas had also quietly put together his own, alternative slate, on which he was running for president himself. He announced his candidacy when he filed his own election petition, complete with a full slate, on the final day on which candidates could gather signatures. In essence, he had outfoxed Stern and Rolfe. This created an urgent problem. the strong likelihood that the indigenous leadership slate would defeat Rolfe's, successfully rebuffing what they perceived as something like a hostile corporate takeover. To fix it, Stern and the national legal team invoked the National Union Constitution. They called hearings and rearranged the structure of other locals in Washington, suddenly taking healthcare jurisdiction away from Salinas and Local 6. This rejiggering also moved jurisdiction for non-nurse hospital workers to the local that had historically consisted only of nurses, and mostly registered nurses, 1199 NW. 15 in the end, the long-term care jurisdiction for private sector nursing home workers and public sector home care was consolidated into Local 775, in which Rolfe didn't run the risk of losing an election. He was appointed the head of the union, a move that was possible because 775 was brand new. To date, the Washington local has unionized 23 nursing homes under 775 contracts, and there has never been a strike run by any of them. Several nursing homes were given to Local 775 as part of the transfer and realignment of the nursing home jurisdiction. Despite being assigned private sector nursing homes, Rolfe kept his focus in the early years of 775 on the strategy with which he was familiar and successful: political deals and public sector home care workers. In keeping with his frequently expressed view that collective bargaining was dead and there was no need to be sentimental about it, he had no strategy for the rough-and-tumble world of private sector organizing. As Steve Lopez discusses in Reorganizing the Rust Belt, 16 nursing home operators had become first-rate union busters. Yet at the same time Lopez was writing this, the early 2000s, he was also describing in detail how another local SEIU union born from 1199, 1199P in Pennsylvania, along with a more militant Western Pennsylvania union, was defeating the nursing home operators in an all-out class struggle. Rolfe didn't believe in class struggle, and so he didn't have a strategy for private sector nursing homes, not until the National Union devised a business plan to help the owners of the financially over-leveraged nursing home industry, that is, the Stern-Rolfe Growth Plan for Private Sector Nursing Home Workers. The workers in the majority of 775's nursing homes were eventually unionized through a top-down and top-secret agreement as part of a national experiment, to partner with nursing home employers in key states. In 2003, the National Union staff, under Stern, decided to embark on an initiative with nursing home operators aimed at increasing the pace of unionization in nursing homes. David Kiefer, the director of nursing home operations for the National SEIU, began a series of discussions with CEOs of national nursing home chains to explore whether the corporations were interested in the initiative. 17 No workers were invited to participate in any of these discussions, nor were they aware of the meetings. Kiefer advanced the National Union leader's interest, which was growth via either card check or an election procedure agreement with employer neutrality. The employers wanted three things in return for SEIU's growth deals. First, the employers wanted the union to deliver increases in Medicaid spending at the state level, the largest source of their income, often called rate reform in policy circles. Second, they wanted tort reform, meaning less liability for nursing home operators if, for example, accidents, deaths, or injuries occurred in their facilities. Finally, the employers wanted status quo management rights inside their nursing homes. In exchange, they would be willing to offer neutrality in unionization campaigns in some form and marginal improvements in the workers' pay, assuming the union could deliver the increases in Medicaid reimbursements to cover the cost. In addition, there was a caveat to the neutrality agreement: the employers would select which nursing homes could be unionized during the life of the accord. If workers at nursing homes not selected by the employer called 775 and wanted help forming a union, the union would be bound to decline. New labor has a term for agreeing to create large geographic areas, an entire state, or perhaps a region of the U.S. in which workers have no right to form a union, even if workers want one, establishing no-fly zones. In Washington, Rolfe embraced the deal immediately, although it would take another year or two before the final agreement to advance the future of nursing home care in Washington could be ironed out. Bigger states, such as California, were a priority for the employers and therefore for Stern. 18 In 2005 the union and Rolfe set to work implementing the agreement, and the deal was finalized between Local 775 and Washington State nursing home employers in 2006.19 that same year. Not coincidentally, 775 lobbied hard for, and secured, sufficient increases in nursing home funding to make it possible under the secret accord to unionize nursing homes, under what was called Phase 1 of the employer agreement. According to the Seattle Times, it was a $20 million transaction. The union had to secure $10 million in additional state Medicaid funding and then generate a federal match. In exchange, SEIU Local 775 got to organize 10 nursing homes, with management's blessing. The 750 new workers doubled the union's nursing home membership. 20. The same article states that in 2007, the union was to secure $120 million for an unnamed number of nursing homes, including funds that had nothing to do with patient care. For instance, about a quarter of the new money in the alliance's proposal would reimburse for-profit nursing homes for the business and property taxes they pay. Paul Kumar, the former political and legislative director for SEIU's California Health Care Local under Sal. Rosselli, and privy to the negotiations, explained the entire national accord as the wounded duck theory of organizing. By this he meant that the for-profit nursing home industry had grossly overleveraged itself and that the national union's idea was to cut a deal to bail out a scumbag industry in exchange for dues payers. 21. But the terms of the secret accord between the union and the employers placed severe limits on the rights of future union members. The union agreed to prohibit the workers from any form of negative messaging or negative campaigning during the life of the agreement. The grievance and arbitration clauses were constrained by language stating that any problem not brought to the grievance process within 15 days would be null and void. Further, in some agreements, only suspension or termination could go to arbitration, which left management as final arbitrator on all other issues, just as in any non-union nursing home. The no-strike clause in the contracts in these agreements excluded the two words modifying most no-strike clauses: no lockout. The final section of the 775 no-strike clause is highly unusual. Upon the termination of this agreement, this Article 23 no-strike clause shall remain in full force, prohibiting workers from engaging in work stoppage over labor contract disputes, and the parties shall engage in prompt, binding interest arbitration to resolve the dispute. The no-strike clause shall survive the termination of this agreement, and this language will automatically be included in all future contracts. 22. Workers' wages in the Washington agreements are considerably lower than Seattle's newly won minimum wage of $15 an hour. 23 And the clauses on wages in the contracts are triggered up or down based on whether the union can deliver specified increases in Medicaid funding from the state. The final clause of a typical 775 nursing home contract includes the following language: the operator, union, and/or arbitrator shall not establish a collective bargaining relationship that would create an economic disadvantage to operator by requiring increases in worker pay, benefits, staffing levels and/or shift ratios that both were not adequately reimbursed by Medicaid revenues and prevented operators' reasonable economic return on operation of the specific operator facility covered by this agreement. Operator will not be required to provide financial records to union or arbitrators. Emphasis added. Almost 15 years after launching Washington's new long-term care local, nursing home workers have achieved little more than their non-union counterparts. The local union, however, gained several thousand dues payers. 1199 New England's origins and approach to private sector nursing homes. 3 widely respected books about the post-McCarthy labor movement, describing bottom-up grassroots organizing within unions, in which dignity, not wages, was the front and center issue, and the workers themselves were the primary lever of power, all focus in whole or in part on the same union. 1199. All 3 books celebrate the ingenuity of the working class and are routinely found on labor sociology syllabi. Rick. Fantasias. Cultures of solidarity, consciousness, action, and contemporary American workers. 24 Stephen Lopez's Reorganizing the Rust Belt. An Inside Study of the American Labor Movement, 25 and Leon Fink and Brian Greenberg's Upheaval in the Quiet Zone, A History of Hospital. Workers' Union Local 1199.26. The very fact that 1199's story is ongoing, that this chapter picks up where these earlier authors left off, and that this union continues to enable workers to be the primary lever of power, including in militant actions and majority strikes, is evidence that Robert Michels was wrong. Oligarchy does not always win. The two individuals chiefly responsible for creating 1199 were both members of the Communist Party, Leon Davis and Elliot Godov. Both were Russian-born Jews, shipped as children to the United States to live with relatives in New York City during the tumultuous period of the Russian Revolution. Both studied to be pharmacists. Davis dropped out of school to start working with the trade union Unity League, an arm of the Communist Party. Godov completed school and began his career, but he, too, was quickly caught up in Communist Party activism. The two men separately navigated various attempts to form pharmacists' unions in New York City, bouncing and being bounced from one purge to the next. In 1957, they finally met. Davis was already president of Local 1199 when he hired Godov to do exactly what Godov had long wanted to do, expand from organizing only pharmacists into general hospital organizing. William Z. Foster, head of the Communist Party during the years that Davis and Godov were learning the organizer's craft, was churning out literature that called on followers to organize every category of workers, not merely a thin stratum of skilled workers at the top. Davis and Godov were not enthusiastic writers of manuals. Davis was barely functional in written English, and in any case they believed that organizers, paid and volunteer, learn through struggle. But a longtime 1199 rank-and-file worker leader, Bernie Minter, who organized Albert Einstein College of Medicine into the Union in the late 1960s, did compile a 51-page manual, typed up in the 1980s, that describes much of the same core technique as Foster's 1936 organizing methods, and includes some identical language. Organizing Private Sector Nursing Homes in 1199 Nay. When the exact arrangement that Local 775 had accepted for unionizing nursing home workers was presented to the leaders at 1199 New England in 2004, we told them to go fuck themselves, says current 1199 Nay president David Pickus, paraphrasing then-President Jerry Brown. When I asked Brown in a recent interview what his objections were, he said, "The state is a huge player in nursing homes. It would be great if we could make demands for increased nursing home funding with the industry, to cooperate with the employer, so long as we didn't have to give away the democratic principle of the workers running their own union. Our position was, we couldn't sell that which we didn't own, and we didn't own the workers' right to make their own decisions in the future. Kiefer and Rolf were selling something they didn't own. We refused to do that." Brown is now retired, but he was the longtime president of what used to be called District 1199 New England, a division of the old national union known as 1199. Brown apprenticed directly with and under Leon Davis, considered the founder of the national union. Brown was a key leader of the contingent demanding greater union democracy at the National 1992 SEIU Convention, the same convention where Stern earned his first anti-union democracy stripes. The reason for the 1992 convention's clash of ideology, or understanding of union purpose and function, went back to late 1989, when many of the local unions in the National 1199 voted to affiliate with SEIU, fulfilling 1199's leaders hoped. The vision of building a national health care workers' union. Brown had attended many of the conventions held by 1199, the former national union, but SEIU was new to him, as it was to a slew of other leaders who had recently voted, local union by local union, to join up and affiliate with SEIU, bringing with them different ideas of the purpose of the union, the role of workers in their own liberation, and the level of democracy a union should have. On March 20, 2001, While Rolfe was planning the campaign to win the ballot initiative to create the Home Care Authority in Washington state, 1199 NE was launching the largest nursing home strike in U.S. history. 27. The workers, overwhelmingly women of color, voted to walk off the job even though they already had the highest wage and benefit standards of any nursing home workers in the nation, including a substantial pension, a real one, not a 401k, an impressive self-funded health care plan, a robust employer-paid training and upgrading fund, a 2- or 3-step grievance and arbitration procedure, and more workplace rights than almost any other non-management employee in the United States enjoys today. 28 The strike was a strike for increased staffing. Jerry Brown said, "The strike muscle is like any other muscle, you have to keep it in good shape or it will atrophy." 29 Since the beginning of the new millennium, Connecticut's nursing home workers have gone on strike every year except 2008 and 2011, for a cumulative total of more than 100 strikes. The action in 2001 was a large multi-employer strike. There have also been 38 work stoppages since 2002. By constantly engaging in strikes and by practicing what is called open collective bargaining negotiations, 1199 NE is constantly engaging in the hardest of structure tests, that is, tests that measure both union democracy and the participation levels of the rank and file. In the same period, more than a decade, that Rolfe has exercised jurisdiction over nursing homes in Washington, 1199 NE in Connecticut has run almost 60 successful NLRB elections, some big, some small. Like the Washington Union, Connecticut's leadership places a premium on securing multi-employer election procedure neutrality agreements. But unlike the Washington Union's agreement, 1199 NE's neutrality agreements are won by worker power and negotiated across the bargaining table, with workers in the room, in a collective bargaining process transparent and open to all members of the union. Through this approach, they have been able to secure neutrality agreements such as one covering 3 unorganized nursing homes, an accord in which the workers surrendered nothing and are not bound by limitations in their contractual rights. In one such recent agreement, there are no binding contract provisions or clauses that are automatically renewed, and the union is not required to lobby for money to pay the workers. The language, far from being secret, is actually printed in the contracts of the workers who fought to win them, and includes the following. The parties agree that the employer will remain neutral and not conduct any campaign in any organizing drive conducted by New England Health Care Employees Union District 1199 SEIU in any unorganized center for long-term care or assisted living owned or operated by the employer or any of its related entities now or in the future in the state of Connecticut. Fighting to expand their union to non-union nursing homes, workers reached this agreement across the bargaining table in the final days of 2012. Under its terms, if the union can present union authorization cards from 40% of workers from any of the 3 non-union facilities, the employer must turn over a full employee list and release a letter to all employees declaring that during the union's campaign the employer will remain neutral and bargain in good faith. Any violation of the neutrality agreement goes to expedited arbitration, with the final decision resting with a pre-selected neutral arbitrator. The workers at the biggest nursing home covered by the agreement, St. Joseph's Manor, successfully won their election in July 2014. Despite the neutrality agreement, the organizers approached the campaign as seriously as they would have any organizing campaign, as a struggle. Rob Barrell, the organizing director of the union and the lead on the campaign, explained the process. "We blitzed the home's workers starting in February. We got a good idea of what the issues were and we began to do leader ID identification by work area. We talked about building to majority to fight the boss, and filed for an election with 70% of the workers on a petition. We had volunteer member organizers with us in every committee meeting from the same employer. They would stand up and say, 'We won this for you, we expect you to now get strong, be prepared to fight and to strike because we expect you to win a common contract expiration with us. Our standards are in jeopardy because you make $3 less than us and you don't have the pension. Our future depends on you and you better be ready to stand up and fight.' 30. When queried why this employer would give a neutrality agreement without asking the workers to surrender anything, David Pickus, the lead negotiator in the fight, explained. We were negotiating with 5 other homes of theirs we already had under contract, so we said, if you don't give us these places, we are going to strike all 5 homes. They knew from past experience we could cause a big problem because we had struck them successfully before. 31. Even though the union had negotiated a neutrality agreement, Beryl states, the discussion with the workers was a traditional discussion. We didn't know if the employer would actually follow the neutrality agreement, so we talked about a fight. We talked about building a majority to be able to build to fight the boss, so that the workers understood that they would have to do the work to build the union. 32. Using the word strike early in the organizing process, as Beryl says they did above, is part of a strategy that pays very careful attention to semantics, which are absolutely key to successful organizing. As 1199's nursing home case in this chapter shows, a key question in 1199 for generations has been, are there 2 sides or 3 in a workplace fight? Upon learning of a union drive, an employer will usually begin an anti-union campaign by declaring, we don't need a third party in here. By third party, the boss means a union is a third party, with the boss being one party and the workers being a second party. In good organizing and in the 1199 approach, a key to victory and to a successful strike vote and strike is that the workers see themselves as the union, in which case there are only 2 sides, a crushing answer to the employer's message. Below are 2 examples from the opening of 2 separate new Millennium training workshops in a CIO-style organizing approach. Both are titled, Semantics, and they reveal the centrality of language and its meaning to the fight, and to the craft of organizing. 33. Introduction. Everything an organizer does must have a purpose that is about moving the vision and the plan forward in their industry. Conversations are the primary vehicle for doing that. Every conversation must include the following. Have a purpose equals 70% discovery. Worker speaks, shift the worker equals 30% union is solution. Organizer speaks, have an ask. Organizing conversations are not about giving information, giving updates, and leaving it up to the worker to decide what to do with that information. Good organizers always have a conversation agenda, which is about how to shift workers in their attitudes, beliefs, and commitment to both their coworkers and their campaign. The second example is excerpted from a set of semantics drills developed by the local union with whom I worked in Nevada. We used 15 examples of how to say something badly or the successful way. These were practiced for an hour daily in the organizing department. Semantics training. Why do semantics matter? Pose question to the group. 2 to 3 minute discussion filled. Square point equals people learn about their union from us and how we talk about it. General principles filled square. Do not third party the union. Examples. Put up the bad statements on the flip chart and have people discuss why they are not good, and then the group comes up with a better answer. 1. Bad equals thank you, as a way to end a conversation. Better equals good talking to you, see you later, look forward to seeing you soon too. Bad equals we need you to get a schedule for us. A. Better equals it's important that you and your coworkers know who works at the facility, what days and when, so that you can be effective and efficient in building your worksite structure. The 1199 nursing home campaign in 2014 that Beryl was describing above was a textbook implementation of the advice to rookie organizers. See below, including postulate number 20, we lose when we don't put workers into struggle. Even with a neutrality agreement, the organizers understand that if the workers don't do the work of building their own union, including preparing for and having a fight, their leadership will not be tested or developed to the level of strength needed for a solid union, one where the rank and file workers themselves can govern the workplace after the election victory. The list below represents the key postulates taken from the characteristic 1199 organizing manual, a handwritten, dated, single sheet of paper that hangs on the door or is pinned on the bulletin board of most 1199 organizers' offices. It is often covered with coffee stains and marking pen notes and is called, simply, Advice for Rookie Organizers. 34.1. Get close to the workers, stay close to the workers. 2. Tell workers it's their union and then behave that way. 3. Don't do for workers what they can do. 4. The union is not a fee for service, it is the collective experience of workers in struggle. 5. The union's function is to assist workers in making a positive change in their lives. 6. Workers are made of clay, not glass. 7. Don't be afraid to ask workers to build their own union. 8. Don't be afraid to confront them when they don't. 9. Don't spend your time organizing workers who are already organizing themselves, go to the biggest worst. 10. The working class builds cells for its own defense, identify them and recruit their leaders. 11. Anger is there before you or, channel it, don't diffuse it. 12. Channeled anger builds a fighting organization. 13. Workers know the risks, don't lie to them. 14. Every worker is showtime, communicate energy, excitement, urgency and confidence. 15. There is enough oppression in workers' lives not to be oppressed by organizers. 16. Organizers talk too much. Most of what you say is forgotten. 17. Communicate to workers that there is no salvation beyond their own power. 18. Workers united can beat the boss. You have to believe that and so do they. 19. Don't underestimate the workers. 20. We lose when we don't put workers into struggle. Realistically, only one of these postulates, number 14, could be practically adopted by an organization like Local 775, and even if 775 did adopt it, it would be applied to external political campaigns in the midst of a machine-like, staff-run, get out the vote, GOTV campaign moment. The team running 775 does heed, every worker is showtime, communicate energy, excitement, urgency and confidence. Professional staff make use of those qualities when driving hard to win a political race or ballot initiative. But taken as a whole, these 1199 postulates can be seen as defining features that separate the organizing approach from the mobilizing approach. For example, most people who call themselves organizers in the new labor model would probably adhere to the list below during the unionization phase, but abandon them soon after. Get close to the workers, stay close to the workers. Anger is there before you or, channel it, don't diffuse it. Channeled anger builds a fighting organization. Every worker is showtime, communicate energy, excitement, urgency, and confidence. Each postulate expresses a core value and reflects 1199's roots in the CIO era. Starting with the first one, a close relationship with all or a majority of the workers can only be formed in a majority worker approach and by working through the organic leaders. And there are other postulates, the most important ones in terms of worker agency, that can only manifest in a model that vests primary power in the workers themselves. Postulate number 2, tell the workers it's their union, and behave that way, is significantly worded, behave, not act, no pretense allowed. That's a commandment, and in the 1199 tradition, it's a commandment with teeth. An organizer can be fired for not behaving that way. Similarly, postulates number 17 communicate to workers there is no salvation beyond their own power. And number 18, workers united can beat the boss. You have to believe that and so do they, conceive of workers as the primary leverage in their own liberation. A professional organizing staffer trying to play Bruce Lee, the lone hero outmaneuvering the boss in a series of high-flying karate moves, cannot replace the workers' army when it comes to the long march. Real. Organizers never underestimate the true fighting value of workers. Workers' struggle is key to the pedagogy. With the kind of endless anti-union warfare waged by employers, for example, documented and superbly described by Kate Bronfenbrenner. There's little question that workers need coaching on the employer offensive that they will face and on how to stay ahead of and beat the professional union busters. According to the 1199 Nay method, 35 falling behind the employer's war is usually fatal. It is crucial that workers know how to build a majority before the first skirmishes begin, and especially before the union busters start threatening workers. For that, you need excellent teachers who can school workers on the stages of an employer fight and coach them through what the workers' side must do before and during each stage of it. If the fight were easy, if workers didn't need good coaches, the vast majority of them would already be in unions, based on the consistently high number of workers in the United States who say they want a union. It's when the boss converts the workplace into a war zone and starts intimidating and firing people that this number drops, and drops considerably. Good organizer coaches are needed to circumvent that attrition by preparing workers to face and fight the worst that management can do. The union difference. What being a unionized nursing home? Worker means in Washington and in Connecticut. As shown in Table 3.1 below, a nursing home worker in New England, where the minimum wage is lower than Washington's, earns substantially more pay on her first day of her first year, and in every year of her working life compared with her counterpart in Washington. 3/4 of 1199 NE unionized nursing home workers in New England have employer-paid health care for themselves and their families, with minimal copays and deductibles. A majority also enjoy a real, defined benefits pension (DB) pension. All employees have the right to take sick time that doesn't draw from their vacation time. Finally, they retain the right to strike at the end of each contract. Through sustained collective action, including the strike weapon, nursing home workers in New England have transformed their workplaces and the quality of their lives. Table 3.1 Contract Comparison, CT versus WA. In Washington state, where the minimum wage is higher, 36 negotiated contractual wages in most nursing homes are considerably lower than in nursing homes in New England. In addition, the contract at many of Washington's locals allows the employer to decrease negotiated wages if Washington decreases Medicaid reimbursement rates, guaranteeing operators a fixed percentage of revenues from the state while passing the risk of lower revenues onto the workers. Moreover, the majority of unionized nursing home workers in Washington have health care coverage for themselves only, not for their spouses or children. These bargain for health care plans, as explicitly stated in the 775 union contracts, are to be identical to those of all non-union workers employed by the same owners. Nursing home workers in Washington also have little opportunity to build retirement savings. They do not enjoy a pension or even an employer match on their 401k. Their contracts specify that their retirement provisions, like their health care plans, shall be identical with those of non-union employees working for the same operators. In Washington, 775's alliance with the employers for a fair election process is controlled by the employers and contingent on the unions making significant financial and other regulatory gains for the employer in the legislature. It places severe limits on the collective bargaining and representation process. It was negotiated with no workers in the room. It was confidential, and it has yielded less than half as many nursing home elections as the 1199 NE has achieved in Connecticut. An article in the Seattle Times 37 quotes the Washington Union's president, David Rolfe, as saying, "Wouldn't it be something if people thought unions weren't about creating problems but they were actually about working with management to solve problems? Where is it written that the thing we need to do most is have fights?" Washington's approach. 3 sides is 3 sides. Connecticut's approach. From 3 sides to 2. In nursing homes in Washington state's Local 775, the employer, the union, and the workers are 3 distinct entities. The union remains a third party, different from the workers, advancing its own interests through negotiations with the employer to meet the employer's primary objectives, increased revenue and status quo management rights. In turn, the union, as a freestanding entity, separate from the workers, meets its own primary objective: growth. The objectives of the third group, the workers, enjoy the least consideration in the negotiations. In this model, there are 3 sides to the bargain, but 2 sides have interests that lie closer together, the union and the employer. These two oppose the primary needs of the workers. Stronger shop floor protections, a meaningful voice in shop rule making, and benefits that, even more than increased wages, might lift them out of poverty. Jonathan Rosenblum is an experienced organizer who got his initial training in 1199 NE's carbon monohypoiodite-style nursing home fights, and then moved to Washington, where he eventually joined and worked on the early stages of the Washington Nursing Home Alliance, but resigned from his position in the Washington local over his frustration with their program. He would later go on to be the campaign director of the nation's first successful $15 an hour campaign, the SeaTac Airport campaign that gave rise to the subsequent Seattle $15 campaign. He sums up his experience with the early implementation of the Washington Alliance as follows. We went to a nursing home where there was a joint labor management presentation on the Alliance plan to lobby the Oregon legislature for more money, a related program that launched before Washington. Per the plan, there wasn't clarity in the presentations that if we were successful then the union would obtain card check recognition at certain facilities. I remember the workers being generally unresponsive to the presentation. Sort of apathetic, low energy. These were not like any other nursing home workers I'd ever seen. What was different? We weren't speaking to their issues. I remember talking to one worker on the side after the meeting. She was uninspired. The meeting didn't address her concerns. They were short-staffed today. She was poor and mistrustful of the boss. The idea of going to lobby for more money didn't meet her needs, which were both immediate and different. She saw the problem as the boss and we were not inviting her to build an organization that met her needs. 38. In strong contrast to the Washington experience, 1199NE today continues to run a successful NLRB election program. The workers routinely strike and win contract standards better than those of any other nursing home workers in the country. They have converted lousy jobs into fairly decent ones. The only reason that 1199NE was not placed in trusteeship in 2004, when, on being presented with the framework of the nursing home industry Alliance, they told the National Union, "Go fuck yourselves," is that in 1989, when members of 1199 voted to join CO, they forced the National Union to sign very strategic and legally airtight affiliation language. Under Sal Rosselli, California's health care workers local did not have such language when its own dispute with the National Union began over this very issue, the Nursing Home Industry Alliance, and so Rosselli's local was placed in trusteeship. I asked Jerry Brown whether he thought his union would have been trusteed without the presence of legal affiliation and jurisdiction language that stipulated that the local union could not be placed in trusteeship without the consent of 3/4 of its own elected executive board. He said, "If we didn't have strong affiliation language, we would already have been forced to merge with the New York mega local right now." The National Union would have made deals with the nursing home bosses without us. They would have created a new local in Connecticut and taken our nursing home jurisdiction away. They'd rearrange everything, set up new locals, eliminate jurisdictions. They did whatever the fuck they wanted. And they were great about having votes, but they rigged every vote to work in their favor by who was allowed to vote. There's no way we would not have been trusteed. 39. The 1199 tradition, the CIO tradition based on identifying pre-existing worker leaders and connecting with them and coaching and apprenticing them through the employer fights is a winning tradition. Organizers in 1199 understand that real fights for life-changing gains can be won only by the workers themselves, led by organic worker leaders. By contrast, the 775 tradition, based on the principles of Stern and Rolfe, does not build worker agency, worker leadership, or worker strength. The union picks leaders based on community organizers' criteria, likability and charisma, commitment to the organization's agenda, attendance at meetings, and ability to speak with the media and chair meetings. In the 1199 model, none of those factors matter. The only factor that does matter is that co-workers trust and respect the worker leader, who might not, and often does not, display the public qualities sought in the 775 model. According to Brendan Williams, the former head of the Washington Health Care Association (WHCA), the employers' lobbying group. One challenge for the union is that they could never get the big players on board. Those guys with the most homes, the national players, who have so much money they can afford their ideology and ignore the union's partnership offers. Williams explained that even though he assured the nursing home owners that David Rolfe was a decent guy, he could not move them. He encouraged the owners to see the entrepreneurial aspect to it, to set aside ideology and look at the union. They aren't being ideological. They don't want to bring about the destruction of capitalism. They want to grow just like you want to grow. But by 2007 it was apparent that the Washington Union ceased growing in nursing homes because the state legislature had voted to lock in a multi-year reimbursement rate that was set to last until 2015. Because Rolfe could no longer increase this rate for the owners, he couldn't draw down more election victories. Shallow advocacy versus deep organizing. Local 775, operating on an advocacy model, cannot help private sector nursing home workers form unions unless they are able to cut a deal with the employer of each home. Private sector nursing homes are a hard test of social movement work. Even Williams, the employer lobbyist, saw clearly that Rolfe's local had no lever to move employers who didn't want to engage in the alliance. In 1199 NE, the union has a long track record of winning very hard fights. They've done it by teaching workers to build their own organizations. The workers are their own lever. Their union is built for a struggle. Rolfe of 775 replaced class struggle with what the 1199 NE team slyly calls class snuggle, not class struggle. David Pickus, 1199 NE's current president, says, "What I understand about our work is that people want a better life, and that's about the relationship between workers and the boss. When I started out, people were afraid to talk about this as an ideological issue. Understand me. This isn't some ultra-left issue, or hard-left. This is what capitalism is. You work in it, you sell your labor, they don't need you, they need all of you. And if you accept that, you'd better get everyone together, because if you want a better life, you need a plan to do that. People have a tremendous respect for you when you talk to them about the truth and where their power comes from and what they will have to do if they want to win. 40. In New England today, as everywhere, workers and their unions are having a harder and harder time. The ongoing decimation of labor unions across the country and the nearly complete acquiescence to the employer alliance model have made the higher participation model increasingly challenging. According to Pickus, the employers have got it down now. It takes them about 10 full days to replace the entire staff of a nursing home for good during a strike. And so 1199A, like most unions in the service industries, will have to make a choice about which strategies to embrace to garner the additional power needed to continue winning in today's conditions. Their parent union, SEIU, beats the drum loudly about deal-making strategies, and may yet drown out 1199's other clear, far better choice, adapting each postulate from their own advice to rookie organizers. To an approach that goes as deep into organizing their members' communities as it does into organizing their members in the workplace.